A grey November afternoon settles over a narrow street in the old neighbourhood, rain pooling in broken sidewalk cracks. Vincent Caruso, 58, steps from a black town car, charcoal suit immaculate, 5 o'clock shadow dark against his broad jaw. He moves toward a storefront, the Olive Garden Social Club, his leather shoes clicking against wet pavement with the rhythm of routine. Marco Benedetti, 52, holds the door open, his scarred jaw catching the weak light as he nods at Vincent in silent greeting. Inside, mahogany paneling and the smell of espresso. 2 men at a corner table fall silent when Vincent passes. He settles into his chair, removes his suit jacket, and a young associate brings a small white cup without being asked. The morning's business is being discussed. Money, territory, consequences, when Vincent's phone buzzes with a message from someone owed. But none of this matters in the moment before. The door opens again to the street, and a child stands framed in the doorway. Sophie Sullivan, 8 years old, fair-skinned with light freckles and honey-blonde hair, wears a pink hand-knit sweater soaked at the shoulders. Her white sneakers are wet and muddy. Her small hands grip a crumpled manila envelope as if it holds her entire world. Her large, anxious grey eyes scan the dim interior, landing on Vincent's face with the certainty of a homing pigeon. Marco rises immediately, his massive frame a wall between the girl and the man in the chair, his hand moving instinctively inside his jacket. Sophie does not flinch. She steps forward, and her voice, thin, steady, trembling slightly, speaks into the silence that has fallen over the room. "Are you Mr. Caruso?" she asks, her gap-toothed smile absent, her round face set with an expression beyond her years. Vincent's dark eyes narrow. He has seen fear, ambition, and desperation enough to recognize each flavor, but this is something else. "Who's asking?" he says, his voice low and measured, the kind that makes men sweat in interrogation rooms they'll never leave. Sophie steps closer, and Marco's hand tightens, but Vincent raises one finger, a single gesture that stops his lieutenant like a trainer stops a dog. "My name is Sophie Sullivan," the girl says, "and I need to give you $5. She opens the manila envelope with both hands and produces a $5 bill, crumpled and worn, along with coins, quarters, dimes, pennies. The money is placed on the table in front of Vincent with the gravity of a state funeral, scattered like a child's greatest treasure. Vincent does not touch it. He leans back in his chair, genuinely curious now, his scarred face unreadable, his dark eyes fixed on the girl. "Why would you give me $5? He asks, and the question hangs in the air like smoke. Sophie's bottom lip quivers once, then steadies. She has practiced this moment 100 times in her mind, lying in bed, counting her babysitting money. "My mom is sick," Sophie says, the words coming faster now. "Really sick. She needs medicine and a doctor, but we don't have enough money." Vincent's expression does not change, but something in his shoulders, barely perceptible, shifts backward, as if the girl has pushed him. "The landlord says we have to move next month," Sophie continues, her voice rising slightly as she rushes toward the heart of it. "He says my mom can't pay rent." "There's a man," Sophie says, and now her eyes are wet, tears beginning to pool in the rims without falling. "A man who comes by our apartment. He told my mom he could help us, with money for the hospital and to stay. He said he could make everything okay." Vincent's jaw tightens. The scar along his left cheekbone seems to deepen in the shadows, and his dark eyes have gone very still. "But my mom got scared. She said we can't take money from that man, that it's not safe, that it comes with," Sophie pauses, searching for the word, "strings. So I saved up my allowance," Sophie continues, pointing at the scattered bills and coins, "from doing chores and babysitting my neighbor's son. I came here because my friend's dad said you're the person who takes care of things, that you help people when they need it. And you're giving me your $5 because," Vincent says, his voice almost gentle now, almost. though no one in the room would dare say it, kind. Sophie's eyes finally spill over. Tears track down her freckled cheeks, and her small hands ball into fists at her sides. "Because I need you to tell that man to leave my mom alone," Sophie says, her voice breaking on the last word. "I need you to help us instead." The silence that follows is absolute, the kind of silence that precedes explosions or miracles, impossible to distinguish between the two. Vincent Caruso, feared throughout 3 counties, stone-faced architect of other people's suffering, stares at the 8-year-old girl who has walked into his social club and stopped the world. His dark eyes move from Sophie's face to the crumpled $5 on the table, then back again, and something inside his chest, long dormant, long believed dead, begins to stir. The rain continues outside. The afternoon light fades incrementally toward evening, and Vincent Caruso, for the first time in 20 years, finds himself unable to speak. Vincent Caruso, age 38, stands in a dimly lit basement garage, blood fresh on his knuckles, watching 2 enforcers drag a screaming debtor toward a concrete pillar. His boss, Salvatore Morti, 60 and grey-haired, nods approval from the shadows. Vincent has just beaten a man senseless for owing $5,000. Vincent wipes his hands on a rag, feeling nothing, understanding that mercy here means death, that softness is a luxury the street devours. Years earlier, Vincent, as a young man of 18, works the docks, watching older men move packages at night, knowing the money calls to something hungry inside him. A lone shark named Russo approaches Vincent in a rain-slicked alley, offering him a chance. Collect debts, keep 30%, ask no questions. Vincent makes his first collection, a construction foreman who owes $3,000, and leaves him with 2 broken fingers and a message that payment is due in 3 days. The money arrives the next morning, and Vincent understands the grammar of fear. It is the only language this world speaks. By 25, Vincent has become Russo's top collector, moving up to more serious work. Territorial disputes, protection rackets, the infrastructure of organized crime. Marco Benedetti, a scarred, imposing man 2 years older, is assigned as Vincent's partner. They are told to make a competitor vanish from the North End. They find him hiding in his sister's basement, and Marco holds the man while Vincent considers what needs to happen, knowing this moment defines him. Vincent pulls the trigger, and the sound echoes in his chest, but his hands remain steady, his face a blank stone, his future suddenly clear. Word spreads through the underworld. Vincent Caruso does what others will not, sees what others cannot, and walks away unchanged by the blood. By 30, Vincent owns 3 social clubs, controls half the city's loan operations, and has built a network of corrupt cops, judges, and politicians. Salvatore Morti, the aging boss, calls Vincent to a private dinner. He is tired, he says, and Vincent is the only one ruthless enough to take what comes next. Within 2 years, Vincent orchestrates Salvatore's graceful retirement, assumes control of the entire operation, and transforms it from chaotic brutality into systematic precision. He moves into a penthouse overlooking the harbour, wears custom Italian suits, drinks 20-year-old scotch, and lives with the understanding that mercy is a word for the weak. Marco becomes his lieutenant and enforcer, the one man Vincent trusts, the one who has stood beside him through murder and extortion and every shade of darkness. For 8 years, Vincent consolidates power. He is feared not just by debtors and street criminals, but by other families, other cities, other organizations. Money flows in from gambling dens, protection schemes, illegal lending, and darker ventures that Vincent delegates to trusted men and never asks about. He has a penthouse, a yacht, a collection of fine art stolen from museums, and a gun in his office drawer that has killed exactly 7 men. Vincent learns that empathy is a liability, that everyone eventually betrays if given reason, that love is a weapon your enemies will use against you. He dates beautiful women who understand the arrangement, companionship, discretion, and the knowledge that he will never let them close enough to matter. At 50, Vincent is at the absolute peak of his power. There is no one who can touch him, no law he cannot buy, no consequence he cannot arrange away. He attends the social club regularly, sits in a back booth, watches his men move through the dimly lit room, feels the weight of absolute control. And then one afternoon, a small girl in a pink sweater walks through the door with 5 crumpled dollars in her fist, asking for help. Vincent's hands, which have strangled a man, stolen from children, ordered the destruction of families, hold the $5 the girl has pressed into his palm. He looks at her hopeful, terrified face, and for the first time in 20 years, something in his chest moves that he thought was long dead. He realizes, sitting across from Sophie Sullivan, that he cannot remember the last time anyone asked him for help instead of fearing him. He realizes that this child has offered him something he destroyed in himself decades ago, the belief that a person can still matter, can still choose goodness. The $5 are not money. They are a question Vincent has been running from his entire adult life, and the girl's voice asking it aloud breaks something open. He understands now that while he climbed to the top of a criminal empire, he descended into a darkness so complete that he had forgotten light existed. And sitting in the presence of that 8-year-old's innocent courage, Vincent Caruso, feared Mafia boss, feels the first crack in the armor that has protected and imprisoned him for 2 decades. He tells Marco later that evening that they need to find the girl's mother, find the lone shark, find out what help is needed and what debt must be erased. Marco's scarred face shows confusion. Vincent has never done anything from generosity, never spent resources on the powerless, never given what could not be returned in profit. But Marco sees something different in Vincent's eyes, something he hasn't seen since they were young men, before the weight of power crushed it, the ghost of a conscience. Vincent sits alone in his office that night, the $5 on his desk, and realizes that Sophie Sullivan has asked him to save her mother by doing what he once wanted someone to do for him. He thinks of his own mother, dead 15 years, who watched her son become a murderer and died of grief and shame, unable to save him because he would not be saved. Vincent pours himself a drink and makes a decision that will eventually unravel everything he has spent 20 years building, one act of mercy at a time. Vincent Caruso stands alone in his penthouse office, 15 years before Sophie would ever knock on his door, staring down at the East River without blinking. A younger Marco Benedetti enters, shoulders filling the doorway, carrying a leather folder that feels heavier than it should. The Castellano operation is finished, Marco says quietly, dropping the folder on mahogany. 8 bodies, no witnesses. Vincent doesn't move, doesn't ask for details. He's learned that asking means caring, and caring means weakness. He remembers being 23, working the docks with Russo, watching a man get beaten for stealing $5 from the register. That man's face, the pleading, the disbelief that the world could turn so quickly, had stayed with him for weeks back then. Now, at 43, Vincent doesn't remember that man's face at all. Russo had taught him the first rule. Sentimentality is a disease that spreads from the heart to the judgment. You must become stone, Russo had whispered one night, holding Vincent's jaw, forcing him to watch an execution in the basement. Stone doesn't break, stone doesn't bleed, stone doesn't love. Vincent had been afraid then, genuinely afraid, but Russo's voice held the certainty of a priest delivering doctrine. So Vincent had swallowed his fear and replaced it with rage, rage with discipline, discipline with an architecture of cruelty that made sense. Each decision hardened him. Deny the young kid from the neighborhood alone forgiveness and watch his mother lose her house. That teaches everyone payment is absolute. Order a kneecapping for a late collection and the whole street understands the cost of dishonor. Fear is cheaper than enforcement. Turn away from your sister's wedding because attending would show attachment, vulnerability. The family business comes first. Sentiment gets you killed. By 43, Vincent had perfected the mathematics of control. He'd built an empire that stretched across 5 boroughs, moving heroin and cocaine, laundering through casinos and restaurants, crushing anyone who challenged him. Marco had been the instrument, loyal, efficient, capable of committing violence without the paralysis of conscience. But Marco still had a conscience underneath. Vincent could tell. Marco came home some nights and drank too much, stared at photographs of his daughter he hadn't seen in 3 years. Vincent had excised that part of himself entirely. What about his family? Vincent asks Marco now, not looking away from the river. We took care of it, Marco replies, understanding without explanation. Which means Castellano's widow lost protection. His children would be marked, his whole bloodline erased from the city's economic life. Proportional, Vincent thinks, clean. He turns and sees Marco's face, jaw tight, scar tissue white under the lamplight, eyes carrying something Marco no longer names. You want something, Vincent says. My daughter, Marco begins, then stops. The girl is 16. She wants to move away, go to school upstate. She says she's ashamed of. Vincent raises a hand, cuts him off. She's right to be ashamed. You should be ashamed. Don't poison her with this world. Marco's face goes very still. It's the only mercy Vincent allows himself, warning Marco that his daughter's revulsion is her salvation, that staying clean is the only win left in a life like theirs. After Marco leaves, Vincent pours 2 fingers of bourbon and sits in the dark. He thinks of his own mother, dead now 8 years, who stopped visiting when he was 35 because she couldn't bear what she saw in his eyes. She'd raised him Catholic, taken him to Mass every Sunday, taught him that forgiveness was the highest virtue. He'd been 12 when she brought him to see a priest about his violent impulses toward other boys, his cruelty on the playground. The priest had told him that Christ suffered for our sins, that redemption was always available if we turned from darkness. Vincent had believed it then, wanted to believe it. But Russo had shown him the real world, a world where priests and mothers and redemption were luxuries for people with money and safety, not street boys with nothing. In this world, Vincent had learned, you don't overcome violence by refusing it. You overcome violence by becoming its master, by making it so total, so overwhelming, that everyone around you understands the cost of resistance and simply complies. For 15 years, the strategy had worked. No one challenged him. No one wanted to. His word was law. His presence was permission and punishment. He'd won. The emptiness in his chest at 2 in the morning, the way food had become ash in his mouth, the silence that followed him from room to room. These were merely the price of empire. Vincent finishes the bourbon and pours another. Outside, the city glitters with 8 million lives, 8 million people believing in futures and mercy and love. He's no longer one of them. He's become what Russo promised. Stone, immovable, incapable of breaking, because you can't break something with no heart. And he's never been more powerful or more alone. He sets down the empty glass and stares at his own reflection in the window, a man in a suit with dead eyes, unrecognizable to himself. Sophie Sullivan's small sneakers splash through a puddle on Ashland Street, her pink sweater bright against grey tenement walls and boarded windows. In their cramped second-floor apartment, Emma Sullivan lies on a worn couch beneath a thin blanket, her breathing shallow and laboured in the afternoon light. Sophie sets down her backpack and moves quietly to the kitchen, where 3 days of unwashed dishes fill a sink that hasn't drained properly in weeks. Emma's pale hand reaches out from under the blanket, and Sophie takes it, small fingers wrapped around her mother's cold ones, their ritual of presence without words. Through the thin walls, a neighbour's television blares. Sophie has learned to hear her mother's cough beneath all other sounds, counting each one like a prayer. At the community centre 2 blocks away, Sophie volunteers shelving donated books, earning $5 a week from Mrs. Patricia, the centre's elderly director. Mrs. Patricia watches Sophie work with meticulous care, never rushing, never complaining. A child doing a woman's job with a woman's worries etched into her small face. Sophie counts her $5 carefully in the library bathroom mirror, watching her own determined grey eyes, telling herself that this will be enough, that it has to be. Emma sits up slowly on the couch, her auburn hair matted, her blue cardigan hanging loose on her thin shoulders, struggling to hide a fresh pain spasm. A knock at the door brings dread. It's the landlord, Mr. Kowalski, demanding 2 months back rent with cold eyes and a clipboard full of eviction paperwork. Sophie watches from the bedroom doorway as her mother's face crumples, as Emma apologizes for things beyond her control, as the older man's patience visibly expires. At night, Sophie hears her mother crying in the dark, muffled sobs into a pillow, the sound of a woman drowning in slow motion while their walls press closer. Emma has kept the doctor's visit a secret from Sophie, but the girl has overheard phone conversations. Cancer, experimental treatment, $3,000 she doesn't have. Sophie walks past the social club on Ashland Street almost every day, watching men in suits come and go, understanding without words that something dangerous lives there. A lone shark named Dimitri has begun appearing in their neighborhood, asking casual questions about Emma, smiling in ways that make the shopkeepers lock their doors early. Sophie overhears her mother on the phone with the hospital. "My daughter doesn't know. Please, she can't know. She's only 8. The desperation in Emma's voice rewires Sophie's entire world. In the public library, Sophie researches how to save a life, finding articles about insurance, fundraising, miraculous interventions, her small hands trembling over the keyboard. Sophie's classmates talk about their families taking vacations. Sophie has never told anyone that her mother sleeps most afternoons because exhaustion is easier than pain. At night, Sophie counts her coins again and again, the $5 spread on her bed like an insufficient prayer, like the last card a child can play. Emma braids Sophie's hair one morning with steady hands, and Sophie sees the effort it takes, the way her mother squeezes her eyes shut against dizziness. The apartment's radiator clanks and hisses, but produces no heat. Sophie and Emma huddle under blankets, their breath visible in the cold, their bodies close for warmth and comfort. Sophie overhears a neighbor tell Emma that Vincent Caruso, the man from the social club, solves problems for people, that he's cruel but he's real, that he doesn't forget a favor. Sophie has never asked her mother for permission because she knows what Emma would say. "No, never, absolutely not. Don't you dare speak to those men." Walking home from the community centre, Sophie passes the social club and notices a man in an expensive suit standing in the doorway, Marco Benedetti, watching the street with the eyes of someone who has hurt people professionally. Sophie's decision crystallizes over 2 weeks. She counts out her dollars one final time, feeling the weight of them, understanding that she is about to step into a world that children aren't supposed to enter. Emma wakes from a fever dream and calls for Sophie, and Sophie comes running, sits on the bed's edge, and makes a silent vow that her mother will get better, somehow, whatever it costs. At Dr. James Chen's clinic across town, Emma sits in an examination room while the doctor delivers news in a gentle voice. Her condition is progressing, treatment is urgent, and time is running out. Sophie lies awake, listening to the city's night sounds, sirens and arguing voices and the hum of a broken refrigerator, and decides that tomorrow she will walk into the social club with $5 and ask for help. Emma reaches for her daughter in the dark and pulls her close, whispering that Sophie is the bravest thing she's ever made, not knowing that bravery is about to announce itself in ways both will spend a lifetime understanding. Emma Sullivan sits on the edge of her bed in the pre-dawn darkness, clutching her abdomen, biting her lip until it bleeds to muffle the sound of her crying. She rises slowly, gripping the doorframe, her legs trembling as she shuffles toward Sophie's room to check if her daughter is still asleep. Sophie lies curled under a thin quilt, her small face peaceful, one hand fisted around something invisible, the $5 she'd counted 3 times before bed. Emma kneels beside the mattress, studying her daughter's face as if trying to memorize every freckle, every soft curve, for a future she isn't sure she'll see. The alarm clock reads 5:47 a.m. when Emma returns to her room, sits at the small desk by the window, and opens the stack of medical bills she's hidden in a shoebox. Her hands shake as she uses a red pen to add the numbers again. Surgery, oncology, chemotherapy, imaging, $43,000 over 6 months. Outside, the city is still dark and cold. Emma lays her head on the desk, surrounded by paper, and allows herself 5 minutes to fall apart. At 6:30, Sophie's voice calls out, "Mama," and Emma rises, washes her face, forces a smile before opening the door. At the community center, Sophie mops the hallway floor under the supervision of Ms. Chen, the director, who watches the girl work with unusual intensity and sadness. Ms. Chen hands Sophie an envelope, $5 in bills and coins, the same amount she receives each week for 5 hours of volunteer work. Sophie counts the money carefully, sliding it into the pocket of her pink sweater, where the previous week's dollars are hidden in a small Ziploc bag. "You work so hard, sweetheart," Ms. Chen says, kneeling down to Sophie's eye level, her voice thick with something the girl doesn't understand. Sophie nods, clutching her pocket. "I'm saving for something really important," she says, then catches herself and looks away. That evening, Emma receives a notice slipped under their apartment door. Eviction proceedings will begin in 30 days if rent is not paid in full. Emma stands in the kitchen, the paper trembling in her hands, and she sinks into a chair, staring at nothing, her mind calculating the impossible arithmetic of survival. Sophie comes home from school, drops her backpack, and immediately asks her mother why she looks sad, pressing a small hand to Emma's forehead. Emma pulls her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair, and tells her everything is fine, everything will be fine, though her voice cracks on the lie. That night, Emma sits at the kitchen table with her laptop, researching loan sharks and predatory lenders, desperate men with desperate solutions, her fingers trembling as she types. She finds the name, Vincent Caruso, and reads articles about his alleged crimes, his reputation, his complete lack of mercy or humanity, and she closes the laptop, horrified and hopeless. In her bed, Emma takes out her phone and calls her ex-husband, the number she hasn't dialed in 2 years, knowing he won't answer, but needing to try. The call goes to voicemail. She hangs up without leaving a message, pressing her fist against her mouth to keep from screaming. 3 days pass. Sophie earns another $5. Emma receives a call from Dr. Chen's office requesting she come in to discuss her treatment options and payment plans. In Dr. James Chen's office, Emma sits across from him in her worn cardigan, hands folded in her lap, as he reviews her scan results with a grave, gentle expression. Dr. Chen explains that her cancer has progressed to stage 3. The recommended treatment regimen will cost approximately $60,000 over 12 months. "I understand this is overwhelming," Dr. Chen says, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes, his voice soft with compassion born from delivering bad news 1,000 times. Emma asks about payment plans, about grants, about anything, and Dr. Chen provides information, but they both know the math doesn't work, that the system is designed to fail people like her. She leaves the office with a folder of pamphlets about financial assistance programs, each one requiring applications she doesn't have energy to complete, documents she can't produce. Walking home through the grey afternoon, Emma passes a pawn shop, a check-cashing storefront, a liquor store, the architecture of desperation lining every block of her neighborhood. She stops at a bus bench and sits down, her legs too weak to carry her further, watching strangers pass by, each one living their own invisible crisis. That evening, Sophie presents Emma with a drawing, a stick-figure woman wearing a crown, holding hands with a smaller stick-figure girl, both of them smiling, surrounded by gold stars. "This is you and me when you're all better, Mama," Sophie says, pressing the drawing into Emma's hands with absolute certainty. Emma's vision blurs. She kneels down and holds her daughter, knowing that Sophie's faith is the only currency that matters, and that she is failing to earn it every single day. Later, after Sophie is asleep, Emma counts the money in the shoebox again. $47 in total medical savings, against a mountain of debt that grows by the hour. She thinks about Vincent Caruso, about people who make impossible things happen through fear and force, and for the first time, she considers the possibility that her daughter might be braver than she is. Outside, rain begins to fall, and Emma sits by the window, listening to it, her reflection ghostly in the glass, disappearing and reappearing with each streak of water down the pane. Sophie notices her mother wincing during breakfast, hand pressed to her ribs, pretending nothing is wrong when Sophie asks if she's okay. At school, Sophie overhears two mothers discussing evictions and foreclosures. The words feel like a foreign language she suddenly needs to learn. Emma sits alone in the dark apartment after tucking Sophie into bed, staring at the stack of medical bills on the kitchen table, her hands trembling. Sophie comes home to find their landlord, Mr. Kowalski, speaking quietly with Emma in the hallway. Emma's face goes pale as he hands her an official notice. That night, Sophie lies awake, listening to her mother cry softly behind the closed bedroom door, a sound she's never heard before and doesn't know how to fix. At the community center, Sophie watches the volunteer coordinator, Mrs. Chen, count out her $5 with unusual sadness in her eyes. Sophie begins noticing small things. The way her mother checks prices at the grocery store, how she takes only half portions at dinner, the worn spots on her cardigan that aren't being repaired. In art class, Sophie draws her mother surrounded by bright colors and light, trying to will it into reality through the power of her crayon. Emma finds the drawing taped to the refrigerator and holds it to her chest, tears streaming down her face, feeling the weight of her daughter's love and the unbearable burden of her secrecy. Sophie overhears a conversation at the laundromat between two women discussing a man, powerful, dangerous, someone who solves problems, and the name stays with her, Vincent Caruso. Lying in bed, Sophie counts her $5 again and again, as though repetition might transform it into the miracle her mother needs. Emma stares at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the hollow woman looking back, and understands she is running out of time to fix this herself. Sophie begins asking careful, quiet questions about the neighborhood, about who has power, about who people fear, and slowly, a plan begins to take shape in her young mind. Emma receives a call from the hospital. Her oncologist wants to discuss new treatment options, but the cost will be another $30,000 she doesn't have. Sophie watches her mother hang up the phone and sit motionless for 5 full minutes, staring at nothing, and knows without being told that something has gotten worse. In the library, Sophie researches Vincent Caruso on the public computer, finding newspaper articles and rumors that paint a picture of a man who solves impossible problems through sheer will and fear. Emma lies awake counting the days until eviction, the hours until her next shift, the weeks of her remaining life, math that no longer adds up to hope. Sophie tucks her $5 into her sweater pocket and practices what she will say, her small voice steady with a determination that doesn't match her age. One morning, Sophie watches her mother struggle to get out of bed, pain etched across her face, and makes a silent promise. She will find a way to save her. Emma holds her daughter close before school, breathing in the vanilla scent of her hair, wondering if she should tell her the truth or let her keep her innocence a little longer. Sophie Sullivan sits cross-legged on the worn library carpet, running her finger down a yellowed local newspaper, clipping about Vincent Caruso, dated 15 years prior. The headline reads, "Doc Boss Caruso takes over Morty operations," and Sophie's grey eyes widen as she traces his photograph, a younger man with cold, predatory eyes. She closes the newspaper carefully, glancing around the empty library section to ensure no one has noticed her research into the man, whose name everyone whispers. That afternoon, Sophie walks home through their neighborhood, suddenly seeing it differently, noticing the social club on Mulberry Street with dark windows and men in expensive suits outside. She pauses across the street, heart pounding, watching Marco Benedetti emerge from the club in his tailored blazer, his scarred jaw catching the late sun as he lights a cigarette. An elderly woman passing by, Mrs. Delgado from the bodega, notices Sophie staring and gently pulls her away, whispering urgently, "Don't look at those men, Mija. Don't ever look." Sophie nods, but her mind is already racing, already calculating, already understanding that the man she's been researching isn't a myth told by scared neighbors. He's real, he's here, he's close. That evening, she sits on her apartment's fire escape while Emma sleeps inside, exhausted from a double shift, and watches the neighborhood settle into darkness. Across the rooftops, she can see the glow of the social club, can hear the faint murmur of men's voices, can feel the invisible weight of power pressing down on every street. Sophie thinks about what she's learned. Vincent Caruso controls loans, protection, territory, and he controls it by making people afraid of what he might do if they don't pay. She realizes with the clarity only children possess that fear is currency here, that power flows not from money, but from the credible threat of violence. And yet, she thinks, if a man like that could be afraid of losing control, or ashamed, or moved by something pure, then maybe he could be moved by her. The next day at the community center, Sophie mentions Vincent Caruso's name casually to Mr. Patterson, the director, testing the waters. Mr. Patterson's entire body goes rigid. He sets down his coffee mug with a sharp clink and tells Sophie very quietly never to speak that name aloud again. "Why?" Sophie asks, though she already knows the answer lives in the tension that just seized her beloved mentor's shoulders. Mr. Patterson kneels to her level, his weathered face serious in a way she's never seen, and says, "Some men own the streets, Sophie. That man owns them. And people who belong to him, they belong to him completely." Sophie absorbs this, filing it alongside everything else she's learned. The fear in her mother's voice when loan sharks call, the way neighbors cross the street to avoid the social club, the stories about businesses that refused Vincent Caruso's protection and mysteriously burned down. That night, she asks Emma casually whether she knows anyone powerful who might help people in trouble, and Emma's face goes pale, her hands trembling as she grips Sophie's shoulders and says, "Don't ever ask that question again. Don't ever look for that kind of help." But Emma's reaction only confirms what Sophie already suspects. Vincent Caruso is her neighborhood's dark god, the one person whose word supersedes the loan sharks, the landlords, the system itself. Over the following week, Sophie gathers intelligence like a tiny, determined spy, learning his routines, discovering that he arrives at the social club most weekday afternoons between 3 and 4 o'clock. She watches from across the street as his black Lincoln Continental pulls up, as Marco Benedetti emerges first to scan the street with cold, protective vigilance. Then Vincent Caruso himself steps out, all coiled power and expensive tailoring, his dark eyes moving across the neighborhood like a king surveying his domain. Sophie realizes with both terror and desperate hope that he is real, he is powerful, and he is the only person in her entire world who might have the authority to stop her mother from disappearing. She counts her dollars again, 5 of them folded carefully in her coat pocket, representing 3 months of weekend volunteer work and absolute belief that somehow this sacrifice will matter. One afternoon, while Emma is at work, Sophie stands outside the social club for what feels like an eternity, her small body vibrating with courage and fear in equal measure. She watches men in expensive suits pass through the dark doorway, watches Marco Benedetti turn away a nervous businessman who approaches begging for something, watches the building itself seem to emanate an almost visible darkness. Sophie's palms sweat, her mouth goes dry. Every instinct screams at her to run, to go home, to wait for something that will never come. But then she thinks of Emma's hollow cheeks, of the eviction notice taped to their refrigerator, of the medical bills her mother thinks are hidden but which Sophie has seen, of the way her mother has stopped eating dinner so Sophie can have more. And Sophie walks toward the door. That night, after the encounter that will change everything, Sophie sits in her mother's arms as Emma sleeps in their narrow bed, and Sophie finally understands the true nature of the neighborhood in which she lives. It is not a place. It is a territory owned by a man, an empire built on fear, a system where power flows from the credible threat of violence, and where survival means knowing which powerful people to approach and how to approach them safely. She has crossed a threshold she cannot uncross, has looked directly at the thing her neighborhood teaches children never to see, has addressed the dark god directly with nothing but $5 and a child's pure desperation. And somewhere in the city, Vincent Caruso sits in his penthouse office, staring at a $5 bill, feeling something crack open inside his carefully constructed chest. Sophie Sullivan sits on her bedroom floor, a worn spiral notebook open, sketching a calendar grid with trembling fingers, counting the weeks ahead. She writes 4 weeks in large letters, underlines it twice, her small jaw set with the quiet determination of someone who has made an irrevocable decision. Emma Sullivan lies in the next room, coughing softly, and Sophie listens from behind her closed door, her stomach tightening with a child's helpless urgency. The next morning, Sophie approaches her mother at the kitchen table, where Emma nurses black coffee and pushes scrambled eggs around a plate she won't eat. Sophie asks in her small, careful voice if there are any extra chores she can do, any way to earn a little more money this week. Emma looks at her daughter, really looks at her, and something breaks in her chest, but she nods and names 3 small tasks: organizing the bathroom, sweeping the kitchen, folding laundry. Sophie completes each chore with ritualistic focus, as if effort itself might be a kind of prayer, as if her small hands moving through these tasks could somehow alter the trajectory of her mother's dying. She earns an extra $3 that week, and on Friday counts her allowance money in the plastic jar beneath her bed, $7.35 total. The next Monday, Sophie begins a quiet accounting in her notebook, small sketches of chores completed, dollars earned, a personal ledger of hope rendered in a child's careful handwriting. She approaches Mrs. Chen, the community center director, and asks if there are additional volunteer shifts available, any way to earn her $5 weekly stipend faster. Mrs. Chen's eyes fill with something tender and sorrowful as she agrees to schedule Sophie for an extra 2-hour shift on Wednesday afternoons. Sophie's week now follows a new shape. School, then the community center for her regular shift, then her mother's chores, then Wednesday's additional hours sorting donations and tidying the children's room. She moves through these tasks with a child's focused intensity, her small body driven by something beyond fatigue, by a purpose that feels as essential as breathing. Emma notices her daughter's new schedule, the way Sophie comes home with dirt under her fingernails, her face flushed from effort, and feels a mother's crushing guilt. One evening, Emma catches Sophie reorganizing their kitchen cabinets, a task she'd never asked her daughter to do, and sits down heavily, watching her child work. She asks Sophie what she's doing, why she's suddenly so busy, if everything is okay at school, her voice carrying the tremor of a woman who senses her daughter is keeping secrets. Sophie meets her mother's eyes and lies carefully. She says she just wanted to help, that she likes being useful, that she's saving for something special, nothing to worry about. The lie sits between them like a small stone, and Emma has no strength left to push further, so she simply thanks her daughter and watches her continue working. By the end of week 2, Sophie has accumulated $18.70, and she transfers it all into a fresh envelope she's hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her closet. She marks progress in a notebook with small sketches, a thermometer filling, a container growing fuller, a silent visual diary of her accumulating power. Sophie begins researching in the library during her lunch period, sketching maps of Mulberry Street, noting the times when Vincent Caruso arrives at the social club, treating her reconnaissance like a child's sacred duty. She observes from across the street, her heart hammering in her small chest, watching the feared man emerge from his black car, watching Marco Benedetti and other men nod in his presence. She documents everything, times, clothing, routines, transforming her terrified observations into facts, as if knowledge itself might make her less afraid. Each night, Sophie lies in bed and whispers to the darkness, rehearsing the words she'll speak, the way she'll hand over her money, the plea she'll make for her mother's life. She imagines Vincent Caruso's face, the way he might respond, whether a man with so much power might recognize in a small girl's desperation something worth acknowledging. In week 3, Sophie has saved $24.12, and she begins the work of planning not just what she'll say, but when she'll say it, how she'll find the courage to actually approach him. She studies the faces of the men who surround Vincent Caruso, Marco with his scarred jaw and dark hooded eyes, others whose names she doesn't know, but whose violence is written into their posture. Sophie realizes that approaching Vincent Caruso is not a simple act. It is a transgression against fear itself, an intrusion into a world that has been constructed specifically to keep people like her out. But her mother's cough has grown worse, and Emma has begun writing something in a sealed envelope she keeps on her nightstand, and Sophie understands that time is no longer a thing she possesses in abundance. In the final week of her 4-week countdown, Sophie earns her last bit of money, an additional $2 from helping Mrs. Chen wash windows at the community center. She brings her envelope home on Friday afternoon, counts out $26.12 onto her bed, and stares at the money with an 8-year-old's mixture of hope and terror. Sophie realizes that this money is not enough, not for a mother who needs thousands, not for medical bills or rent or the weight of a disease that's eating her alive from inside. But she understands now what she'd sensed all along. That money itself is not the transaction she's offering, that she is offering something far more precious and far more dangerous to a man like Vincent Caruso. She is offering him the chance to prove that, beneath the scar on his cheek and the darkness in his eyes, something human still remains. Sophie seals her money in the envelope and hides it in her backpack, and decides that on Monday morning she will go to Mulberry Street and do the thing she's been gathering courage for all these weeks. The night before, she lies beside her sleeping mother in the darkness, listening to Emma's labored breathing, and whispers a promise. "I'm going to save you, Mama, even if I have to ask the devil himself." Emma, half asleep, reaches out and pulls her daughter close, and neither of them knows that by this time tomorrow, everything will have begun to change. Sophie Sullivan opens her piggy bank, a chipped ceramic cat, and counts her dollar bills one final time on her bed. 26 crumpled dollars lay spread across her pink hand-knit sweater, more money than she has ever held at once. She folds each bill carefully, the way she has watched Emma fold laundry, making them neat and official-looking. Her grey eyes move to the notebook where she has tracked every dollar earned. $3 from Mrs. Chen's garden work, 2 from returning bottles, 1 from dog walking, 5 from the community center volunteer hours. The numbers feel like evidence of something sacred, proof that she did not imagine this was possible. Sophie slides the bills into a white envelope she decorated with a drawing of her mother smiling, the way Emma used to smile before the coughing started. She writes "important" on the front in careful, deliberate letters, the way a person writes something that matters. In the mirror above her dresser, she practices her voice. Calm, brave, the way she imagines a person sounds when they are asking for something that could save a life. She whispers, "My mother is very sick, and I have $5." The words feel impossibly small for what she needs them to carry. Emma stands in the kitchen making tea, moving slowly, one hand pressed against the counter as if the ground might shift beneath her. She watches her daughter through the doorway, Sophie sitting on her bed, envelope in lap, moving her lips silently as if rehearsing something important. A mother knows when her child is keeping secrets, and Emma's exhausted heart tightens with a fear she cannot name. She wants to ask Sophie what she is preparing for, but the asking would require admitting that she has failed, that her daughter has had to become someone older than 8, someone who carries weight. Emma turns back to the stove, tears sliding silently down her hollow cheeks as the kettle begins to steam. Sophie lies in bed that night, Sunday 1 week before the encounter, and cannot sleep, though her body aches with tiredness. She holds the envelope against her chest and imagines what might happen when she gives the $5 to Vincent Caruso. She does not know what a mafia boss actually does. She only knows he is powerful, that people fear him, that he is the only person large enough to stand between her mother and the darkness that is swallowing them whole. In her mind, the money becomes magic. $5 is enough, if offered to the right person, if offered with enough courage and faith. She rehearses the moment again and again, her voice steady, her hand not shaking as she places the envelope in his hand, her grey eyes meeting his. She imagines he will pause, the way people do when they recognize something true, and then he will say yes. Monday morning arrives with ordinary grey light and the sound of the city waking up. Sophie dresses in her pink hand-knit sweater, the nicest thing she owns, and navy pants and white sneakers that Emma cleaned for her the night before without saying why. She braids her honey blonde hair herself, pulling it tight, wanting to look older, more serious, more like someone whose request deserves to be heard. Emma watches from the kitchen doorway, and something in Sophie's care with her appearance makes Emma understand that her daughter is not going anywhere ordinary today. "Where are you going, baby?" Emma asks, her voice thin as paper. "Just to the community center," Sophie answers, the first lie she has ever told her mother, and it burns her throat like fire. Emma nods slowly, accepting this, because she no longer has the strength to push for truth, and because part of her knows her daughter is protecting her by not revealing what she has already learned about how bad things really are. Sophie touches her mother's cold hand, cold even in the morning because Emma's body is failing, and she feels the smallness of her own palm against her mother's fragile fingers. "I'm going to fix things, Mom," Sophie whispers, and she means it with every cell of her body, with every dollar she has saved, with every ounce of courage she has been building for 4 weeks. The walk to Mulberry Street feels both eternal and too quick. Sophie's sneakers tap against the sidewalk in a rhythm that matches her heartbeat. Fast, fast, fast. She passes the bodega where she helped stack shelves for quarters, the library where she researched Vincent Caruso's name and read about the Mafia, the park where she used to play without worry when her mother was well and the world made sense. Everything looks the same and completely different, as if she is seeing her neighborhood for the first time or the last time. She can feel the envelope in her pocket like a heartbeat separate from her own, the $5 pressing against her ribs, every dollar representing a version of herself, the girl who was willing to work, to sacrifice, to try. The social club appears before her, a brick building with dark windows and a heavy black door, the kind of place that seems to hold its breath. Sophie stops on the opposite sidewalk, her legs suddenly uncertain, her courage suddenly thin. She thinks of Emma's face at breakfast, the way her mother could barely lift the teacup, the way she tried to hide how much her body was hurting. She thinks of the eviction notice she found in the trash, stamped with numbers that meant leave or lose everything. She thinks of the word, cancer, that she learned means slow disappearing, and she thinks of all the ways she has tried to love her mother back into existence, and how none of it has been enough. Sophie takes the envelope from her pocket and holds it in both hands, as if the $5 inside might blow away on the wind. She crosses the street toward the dark door, toward the man who is not supposed to be approached, toward the only person in her world who has enough power to change the outcome of her mother's suffering. The moment feels like stepping across a line she cannot step back across, not because she doesn't want to, but because her mother is dying and she is 8 years old and she has $5 and nowhere else to go. She reaches for the handle of the black door, her small, delicate hand trembling. She is no longer a child asking for help. She is a daughter saving her mother's life, and she will not let her hands shake when she does it. Sophie Sullivan pushes the door open and steps into the darkness, into the lion's den, into the moment that will change everything. Sophie sits cross-legged on her bedroom floor, the 5 crumpled dollar bills arranged in a careful line before her, each one a small victory earned through weeks of chores and volunteer shifts. She picks up the worn notebook where she's written and rewritten her words, her 8-year-old handwriting growing steadier with each practice run. From the living room, the sound of her mother Emma coughing, a wet, exhausted sound that makes Sophie's chest tighten, reminds her why she can't sleep tonight. Sophie closes her eyes and whispers the words aloud. "Mr. Caruso, my name is Sophie Sullivan, and my mom is very sick, and I have $5. She opens her eyes and tries again, her voice smaller, less certain, exactly like it will sound when terror fills her throat tomorrow. The apartment is quiet, except for the radiator's metallic ticking and the distant sound of sirens on the street below, the ordinary sounds of their neighborhood that suddenly feel like a countdown. Sophie folds the $5 into an envelope she made from construction paper, creasing it with the care of someone preparing an offering. She writes her name on it in careful letters, then crosses it out, unsure if the Mafia boss will even care who it comes from. In the next room, Emma stirs in her sleep, and Sophie creeps to the doorway to check on her mother's breathing, a habit born from nights when she wasn't sure it would continue. Emma's face in the darkness looks hollowed by illness and worry, her auburn hair darkened with sweat against the pillow, her body under the blanket so small it barely makes a shape. Sophie watches for a full minute, counting her mother's breaths the way Dr. Chen taught her to count her pulse, and feels her own throat close with unshed tears. She returns to her bedroom and picks up the $5 again, needing to confirm they're real, that her preparation is real, that tomorrow will actually happen. The pink sweater she'll wear tomorrow hangs on the chair, not her best one, because best things break, but sturdy and neat, the kind a responsible daughter might choose for an important meeting. Sophie practices her posture in the mirror, standing as tall as her 310 frame allows, trying to look older, braver, like someone a powerful man might actually listen to. She repeats the words again, and again, watching her small face in the dark glass, the freckles across her nose, the gap in her front teeth where a baby tooth fell out last month, the large, anxious grey eyes that won't stay calm no matter how many times she rehearses. The clock on her nightstand reads 11:47 p.m., and Sophie knows she should sleep, knows that tomorrow requires her to be sharp and brave, but her body feels wired with electricity. She opens her backpack and checks the envelope one more time. The $5 is still there, slightly wrinkled from her nervous handling, but intact and real. A memory surfaces. Emma braiding her hair 3 weeks ago, before the illness took so much of her strength, saying, "You're so brave, baby girl," words meant to comfort, but now feeling like a prophecy. Sophie lies in bed, staring at the crack in the ceiling that looks like a lightning bolt, and imagines the social club on Mulberry Street, the dark brick building she researched obsessively, the black door, the men in expensive suits. She tries to picture Vincent Caruso's face, constructing it from the glimpses she caught when he arrived last Thursday, the high cheekbones and the scar. the way he moved like something dangerous in a charcoal suit. Her heart rate quickens, and she has to breathe slowly through her nose, the way Mrs. Patterson taught her during the anxiety exercises at school. She thinks about what Marco Benedetti might do if she approaches, the lieutenant with the scarred jaw who stands outside the social club like a stone guardian, and reminds herself that she is small enough that they might not even notice her at first. Sophie gets out of bed and goes to her mother's room again, this time climbing carefully into bed beside Emma, needing to feel the warmth of her mother's presence, needing to remember exactly who she's doing this for. Emma stirs but doesn't wake, and Sophie lies in the dark listening to her mother's breathing, feeling the thin rise and fall of her chest, understanding with the clarity that only children possess that time is running out. She thinks about Dr. Chen's kind face and the word progression, a word that sounds gentle but means terrible things, and knows that tomorrow is not optional, not a choice, but a necessity. Back in her own bed, Sophie returns to the practice, running through the words one final time, imagining different reactions. Vincent Caruso turning her away, Vincent Caruso laughing, Vincent Caruso listening. She touches the envelope beside her pillow like a talisman, like 5 crumpled dollars can somehow shift the gravity of a desperate world. The night deepens, and Sophie's eyes grow heavy, her practiced words beginning to dissolve into the half-logic of dreams. She dreams of her mother standing, healthy and whole, thanking someone tall and powerful, though she can't quite see his face in the dream-logic darkness. Around 4 a.m., Sophie wakes from the dream with a start, her small body drenched in anxious sweat, and she lies still in the darkness, running through the words one more time to make sure she hasn't forgotten them overnight. The envelope is still there, real and tangible, her $5 waiting in the dark, and Sophie breathes the breath of someone who has made a decision and now must live into it. She watches the sky gradually lighten from black to dark blue to grey, counting the minutes until morning, until the day that will change everything, until she walks through that black door and speaks words that will either save her mother or prove that even courage isn't enough. Sophie Sullivan wakes before dawn, her small frame rigid beneath the thin quilt, every muscle tensed, as though her body already knows what today demands. She lies in the darkness of her shared bedroom, listening to her mother Emma's laboured breathing from the other bed, counting each exhale like a prayer. The envelope sits on Sophie's nightstand, $5 carefully folded inside, the result of 8 weeks of volunteer shifts and saved allowance, representing every future she has imagined. Sophie rises slowly, moving barefoot across the cold wooden floor, her small shadow passing through a shaft of pale morning light from the window. She dresses in her pink hand-knit sweater and navy pants, choosing the clothes carefully, aware on some level that how she looks matters when approaching a man like Vincent Caruso. In the bathroom mirror, Sophie's large grey eyes stare back at her, anxious but unbroken, and she practices her words one final time, her gap-toothed voice barely audible. She returns to the bedroom and watches Emma sleep, her mother's face thin and hollowed by illness, and Sophie feels the weight of the decision settle deeper into her chest. Sophie picks up the envelope and holds it for a long moment, feeling the fragility of $5 in her small hands, wondering if it will be enough. She leaves a note on the kitchen table saying she has gone to the community centre, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue as she writes it in careful child's handwriting. Sophie steps outside into the grey March morning, the streets of her neighbourhood quiet and unfamiliar at this hour, the city still belonging mostly to itself. Her sneakers move across the sidewalk toward Mulberry Street, each step deliberate, her heart already beginning its frantic rhythm in her small chest. The social club emerges from the morning mist like a dark monument, the black door, the boarded windows, the brick facade that has haunted her research and her nightmares for weeks. Sophie stops half a block away, her breath coming shallow, her fingers gripping the envelope so tightly that her knuckles pale. A delivery truck rumbles past, and she flinches, pressing herself closer to the building line, reminding herself that she is small, that she belongs to this neighborhood, that no one is watching. But her heart knows the truth. Someone is always watching on these streets, and Vincent Caruso sees everything that happens on his territory. She moves closer, one slow step, then another, the distance between herself and the black door shrinking with each moment she refuses to turn back. Her mind flashes to Emma in bed, to the medical bills stacked on the kitchen table, to the eviction notice with its red stamp that means their time is running out. Sophie reaches the black door, and she stands before it, a small 8-year-old girl with honey blonde hair and frightened grey eyes, holding $5 like it is a key that might unlock salvation. Her small hand hovers near the door handle, trembling, and she closes her eyes for a moment, gathering something from deep inside herself. Not courage exactly, but something like necessity. She knocks 3 small raps against the black door, the sound barely audible even to herself, wondering if anyone inside could possibly hear such a timid sound. Nothing. Silence. The morning air is cold against her face, and Sophie feels her resolve beginning to fracture. She knocks again, harder this time, her small fist connecting with the black door with more conviction, and this time she hears movement from inside. A shadow appears behind the frosted glass panel, and Sophie's breath catches, her entire body going rigid with fear and anticipation. The door opens slowly, and a large man fills the doorway, Marco Benedetti, Vincent Caruso's lieutenant, his scarred face studying the small girl on his doorstep with confusion and immediate suspicion. Sophie's mouth goes dry, her prepared words scattering like startled birds, and for a moment she cannot speak at all, only stare up at the enormous man before her. "What are you doing here, kid?" Marco's voice is rough and dangerous, and Sophie feels the full weight of her mistake, approaching the wrong man, the enforcer, the one who kills people. I need to see Vincent Caruso," Sophie manages, her voice small but steady, the words she has rehearsed 1,000 times finally finding their way out. Marco's scarred face darkens with something like anger or confusion, and he glances over his shoulder into the darkness of the social club, then back down at the child. "Where are your parents, little girl? What is your name?" Marco leans against the doorframe, and Sophie understands that this man could end her story with a single decision. "My name is Sophie Sullivan, and I need to talk to Vincent Caruso, please," she says, and her politeness in the face of such danger seems to confuse the man further. Marco stares at her for a long moment, his hooded dark eyes searching her face, trying to understand what threat or trap a small child might represent. "Go home," he finally says, but his voice carries less certainty than before, and he begins to close the door. "Wait," Sophie says, and her hand shoots forward, extending the envelope, her voice gaining something like strength. "Please, it's important. It's about my mom." Marco pauses, his hand still on the door, something shifting behind his scarred face. A recognition, perhaps, of the desperation that only a child could carry so openly. "Stay here," he says finally, and he disappears back into the darkness of the social club, leaving Sophie alone on the threshold, her heart thundering in her ears, the point of no return already far behind her. Sophie stands in the morning cold, her small frame barely taking up space in the doorway, waiting for whatever comes next, understanding that she has crossed into a world from which there may be no safe return. Sophie waits outside the black door on Mulberry Street, her hand trembling as she clutches the envelope of $5, listening to Marco's footsteps receding into the darkness. The afternoon sun casts long shadows across the empty street, and Sophie counts her breaths the way her mother taught her when the nightmares came. Inside the social club, Marco Benedetti descends the narrow staircase toward Vincent Caruso's office, his dark hooded eyes carrying the weight of what he's just witnessed. Vincent Caruso sits at his mahogany desk reviewing ledgers, his broad muscular frame perfectly still, when Marco stops in the doorway without knocking. Marco tells Vincent about the small girl with grave eyes and an envelope of savings, watching for the Mafia boss's reaction with the knowledge that comes from 30 years of partnership. Vincent's jaw tightens almost imperceptibly, his dark, deep-set eyes lifting from the ledger to Marco's scarred face, a question forming that he doesn't speak aloud. Outside, Sophie's small, delicate legs begin to ache from standing, and she sits on the cold concrete steps with the envelope still pressed against her pink hand-knit sweater. Inside, Vincent stands and walks to the window overlooking Mulberry Street, his silhouette massive against the afternoon light, his mind flickering with a memory he'd long buried. Marco watches Vincent's profile and recognizes the subtle shift, a fracture in the facade that 20 years of power usually keeps sealed. Sophie looks up at the building's facade and sees a figure move past a window on the second floor, and her heart quickens with the understanding that she's been noticed. Vincent's hand, weathered and scarred, rests against the window frame as he observes the small girl sitting on his steps, her blonde hair catching the light. Downstairs, the black door opens and Marco emerges to stand beside Sophie, his imposing 63 frame casting her entirely in shadow. Sophie looks up at Marco's jagged scar and scarred jaw, fear and determination warring across her small round face as she rises unsteadily to her feet. Marco nods once toward the interior darkness, his thick neck turning with ancient authority, and Sophie understands she has been granted passage. The girl takes a step toward the threshold, her white sneaker crossing from the public street into Vincent Caruso's private territory, and the door closes softly behind her. Sophie's eyes adjust to the dimness of the entryway, dark wood, the smell of old money and leather and tobacco, as her courage becomes something visible, almost tangible. Upstairs, Vincent Caruso turns from the window and walks toward his office door, his 61 frame moving with the deliberate slowness of a man considering a choice he thought he'd already made. The staircase Sophie must climb is long and narrow, dimly lit by sconces that cast her shadow enormous against the walls, making her feel simultaneously powerless and impossibly large. Each step costs her something, not fear now, but the final fragments of doubt, burned away by the absolute necessity that brought her here. At the landing, a hallway stretches in both directions, and Sophie hears the scrape of a chair being pushed back, the sound of Vincent Caruso rising from his desk. Vincent emerges from his office doorway into the dim hallway light, his grey-haired head tilted down slightly, his broad shoulders filling the passage as he moves toward the staircase. Sophie freezes halfway up the final flight, her small body suddenly aware of the sheer scale of the man descending toward her, his dark suit perfectly tailored across his muscular frame. Vincent's deep-set dark eyes meet hers, and time seems to suspend itself in the narrow staircase where an 8-year-old girl stands holding everything she has saved. Sophie's voice emerges small and steady as she grips the envelope, each word she's practiced for weeks now pouring out in a whisper that echoes in the enclosed space. "I have $5, Sophie says, her grey eyes locked on Vincent's scarred face, her hand extending the envelope up toward him. "Please help my mom." Vincent's jaw tightens, his prominent nose flaring slightly as he processes the sight. The child, the envelope, the $5 that represents a kind of faith he'd once possessed. The scarred Mafia boss stops walking, his leather shoes creaking slightly as his weight settles, his entire being arrested by the simple words and the desperate innocence they carry. Sophie's gap-toothed face is drawn with the kind of gravity that should never belong to an 8-year-old. Yet here it is, unmistakable and absolute. Vincent's scar along his left cheekbone seems to deepen in the halogen light as his expression shifts, not soft, not broken, but something more complex and harder to name. He looks at the envelope, at the $5 she has saved, and in his mind he sees the dock where he once worked, where a young man named Vincent Caruso believed that $5 could matter, Sophie's small, delicate hand trembles slightly as she holds the envelope forward, her white sneakers barely reaching the edge of the stair above. Vincent descends one more step, his broad, muscular frame bringing him closer to eye level with the girl, his 5 o'clock shadow darkening his pronounced jaw as he lowers himself. The Mafia boss studies Sophie's face, her round, soft cheeks, her anxious grey eyes, the freckles across her fair skin, and sees not a supplicant but a mirror of something he'd chosen to kill. Sophie's breathing steadies as she witnesses his stillness, understanding somehow that this moment, this pause, this examination of her face by a feared man is not cruelty but something else entirely. Vincent's hand rises slowly from his side, his weathered fingers approaching the envelope of $5 that Sophie Sullivan has held toward him like a prayer. In the dim hallway of the social club on Mulberry Street, a Mafia boss reaches for an 8-year-old girl's savings and freezes, because in that moment he feels something crack open inside him that he'd spent 30 years trying to destroy. Sophie whispers her mother's name, Emma Sullivan, and watches as Vincent Caruso's dark eyes close briefly, as if the name itself is a weight he's being asked to carry. Outside on Mulberry Street, the afternoon light continues its slow descent toward evening, indifferent to the fact that something immeasurable is shifting in the darkness above. Sophie stands in the dim stairwell, her small frame swallowed by shadow, 5 crumpled dollar bills extended in a trembling hand toward Vincent Caruso. Vincent stops mid-step, his shadow falling across the child's face, and for the first time in 30 years, the feared Mafia boss does not move away from vulnerability. Sophie's large grey eyes lock onto his dark ones, unafraid in the way only an 8-year-old can be when she has nothing left to lose but everything to gain. Vincent's jaw tightens as he studies her face, the determined set of her mouth, the freckles across her pale nose, the way her whole body shakes but her gaze does not waver. The stairwell grows impossibly quiet, the ambient hum of the social club below fading into distance, as if the world has held its breath. Sophie speaks in a voice barely above a whisper, saying her mother's name like a prayer, like a spell, like the only truth that matters in this moment. Vincent's hand, which has broken bones and signed death warrants, slowly rises, as if moving through water, drawn toward the $5 the girl holds out. Marco Benedetti watches from the landing above, his scarred jaw slack, witnessing something he has never seen in his partner of 20 years, hesitation in the presence of a human being. Sophie tells Vincent about Emma's illness, about the bills, about the eviction notice, about sleepless nights spent listening to her mother cough in the dark room next to hers. Vincent's deep-set eyes glisten in the overhead light, a reaction he has not allowed himself in decades, a moisture that might be tears or might be the body's involuntary protest against stone walls. The $5 remain suspended between them, a bridge between two impossible worlds, as Sophie says. She doesn't know I'm here. She doesn't know I'm scared. Vincent's breathing changes, becomes deeper, more deliberate, as if he is surfacing from underwater after holding his breath for a lifetime. Sophie's voice cracks when she explains that she saved the money from volunteer work, from chores, from believing that somehow this small amount could matter to someone powerful. Vincent reaches out, his thick fingers moving with unexpected gentleness, and takes the envelope from Sophie's shaking hand. The moment his skin touches hers, something shifts in his face. Not softness, exactly, but a recognition, as if he is seeing both the girl and some part of himself he thought was dead. Sophie watches as Vincent opens the envelope, counts the bills with a slowness that suggests he is reading scripture rather than currency. Marco descends the stairs, his heavy footsteps announcing him, and stops beside his boss, his scarred face unreadable but his body language protective of the moment unfolding before him. Vincent closes the envelope carefully, as if it contains something sacred, and looks down at Sophie with an intensity that would terrify most people, but only makes her stand straighter. Sophie says, "Her name is Emma Sullivan," and Vincent's throat contracts as if the name itself has physically struck him. Vincent asks the child her name, his voice rough from disuse, gravel over still water, and when she answers, Sophie, something in his chest seems to reorganize itself. Sophie explains where her mother lives, the apartment number, the street, the fact that Emma works at the hospital and comes home exhausted and afraid of what will happen next. Vincent listens with the focused attention of a man who is hearing the most important information of his life, though it is just the geography of a child's desperation. Marco steps forward and gently places a large hand on Sophie's shoulder, the gesture surprising in its protectiveness, and she does not flinch. Vincent tucks the envelope into his jacket pocket, over his heart, in a gesture that feels deliberate and ceremonial, as if he is making a vow before witnesses. Sophie asks if he will help her mother, if the $5 is enough, if he understands what she needs from him. Vincent kneels, an act of tremendous physical and psychological impossibility for a man of his stature and power, so that his eyes are level with hers. In the kneeling, something monumental happens. The feared Mafia boss, who built his empire on the ash of his own humanity, chooses to acknowledge the humanity of an 8-year-old girl. Vincent tells Sophie that he will help her mother, and the words come out as a promise that feels heavier than any contract he has ever signed in blood. Sophie's face transforms. The tension releases. The worry lines that have no place on a child's forehead seem to smooth away, replaced by cautious hope. Vincent asks Sophie if she is afraid, and she nods, honest in the way children can be, and he tells her she was very brave to come here. Sophie explains that she was afraid her whole life, but that her mother was more important than her fear, and Vincent's face crumples slightly with an emotion he cannot name. Vincent tells Sophie that she must go home now, that her mother is probably worried, that he will take care of the rest. Marco walks Sophie to the black door, his imposing frame suddenly gentle, and when he opens it onto the March afternoon light, the girl steps back into her ordinary world transformed. Vincent stands alone in the stairwell, holding the envelope containing $5, and for the first time since he was a boy, he allows himself to weep. Sophie's small hand trembles as she extends the crumpled envelope toward Vincent Caruso, her voice barely above a whisper, but steady with the weight of 8 weeks of preparation. Vincent stares at the $5 in the girl's palm, unable to move, unable to speak, his dark eyes fixed on the physical proof of her desperation and courage. Sophie takes a breath and speaks her rehearsed words, telling Vincent about her mother's illness, the eviction notice, the impossible medical bills, her grey eyes never leaving his face. Vincent's jaw tightens as Sophie describes Emma's struggle, as if each word is a stone landing in the still pond of his chest, rippling outward through 30 years of carefully constructed numbness. Sophie's voice cracks slightly when she tells him that her $5 is every dollar she has ever saved, earned through volunteer work and extra chores, all of it for her mother. Vincent's scarred hand rises slowly, and for a moment Sophie fears rejection, but instead his fingers close gently around the envelope she's holding, accepting her offering as if it were a sacrament. Sophie explains that she doesn't know what Vincent can do, only that he is powerful, only that her mother has nowhere else to turn, only that she has chosen to trust a stranger with her family's last hope. Vincent's voice, when it finally emerges, is barely a whisper, a sound so quiet that Sophie has to lean forward to hear it, as if his words are fragile and might break if spoken too loud. Sophie watches as Vincent's dark eyes glisten, as something cracks open in the face of the man she has been terrified of, as the feared Mafia boss becomes, for just a moment, someone capable of weeping. Vincent tells Sophie that he will help her mother, that the $5 she has given him is a promise he will keep, that no one will take her home or her mother away from her. Sophie's throat tightens as Vincent makes his solemn promise, her small body shaking with the release of 8 weeks of terror and determination, finally reaching its breaking point. Vincent reaches out and gently touches the top of Sophie's head, a gesture so tender it seems impossible coming from his massive, scarred hand, and in that touch is the weight of a vow. Sophie nods, unable to find words, and turns to leave the stairwell, her legs unsteady beneath her, her heart finally beginning to believe that her mother might be saved. Vincent stands alone in the dim stairwell after Sophie has gone, the crumpled $5 envelope still in his hand, and tears begin to roll down his weathered face in the darkness. Marco Benedetti finds Vincent moments later, standing motionless in the stairwell, tears streaming down the face of the man he has served for 30 years, and understands that something fundamental has shifted. Vincent looks at Marco and tells him, in a voice that sounds like grief and rebirth combined, that they are going to help the Sullivan family, that this is not a negotiation but a command. Vincent places the $5 envelope carefully on the table in his office, treating it like the most valuable thing in the room, and understands that he has just made a promise that will cost him far more than money. In her small apartment across the city, Emma Sullivan lies in bed unaware that her daughter has just set in motion a collision between two worlds, the underworld and the ordinary world of a struggling mother and her desperate, courageous child. Sophie walks home through the streets of her neighborhood, her heart pounding, her hands empty of money but full of a strange new hope that feels fragile and impossible and real. Vincent sits alone in his office, looking at the $5, understanding that he has just agreed to something that will require him to be a different man than he has spent 30 years becoming. Sophie climbs the stairs to her apartment and finds her mother awake and waiting, and for the first time in weeks, she allows herself to believe that the terrible weight she has been carrying might finally be lifted. Vincent makes a phone call to one of his accountants, instructing him to pay off Emma Sullivan's medical debt and secure her apartment for the next year, the first act of a transformation that terrifies and liberates him in equal measure. Sophie sits beside her mother's bed and holds her hand, keeping the secret of what she has done, understanding in her 8-year-old way that some acts of courage must remain hidden until the moment they bloom into salvation. Vincent lies awake through the night, the $5 bill placed carefully in his safe, a relic of the moment when his carefully constructed empire finally cracked open to let in something he thought was gone forever. Sophie sits across from her mother Emma at their small kitchen table, the morning light catching her face as she struggles with the weight of her secret. Emma studies her daughter's expression, noticing the shift in Sophie's eyes. Something changed, something hopeful where there had only been fear. Sophie takes a breath and begins to speak, her voice small but certain, telling her mother that she went to see someone who can help them. Emma's face tightens with worry and confusion, asking Sophie what she means, where she went, what she did. Sophie explains that she walked to Mulberry Street and found the social club, her words coming faster now, no longer able to carry the lie alone. Emma stands abruptly, her chair scraping back, her voice rising as she asks if Sophie went to see Vincent Caruso, the Mafia boss everyone fears. Sophie nods, her grey eyes steady despite her trembling, and tells her mother that she offered him her $5 to help protect them. Emma sits back down slowly, her hand covering her mouth, as the magnitude of what her 8-year-old daughter has done crashes over her like a wave. Sophie reaches across the table and takes her mother's hand, her voice becoming clearer, steadier, speaking words that seem too wise for such a small child. "Mommy, I know you're sick," Sophie says, her gap-toothed smile gone, replaced by an expression of heartbreaking clarity and love. "I heard you crying at night when you think I'm sleeping, and I saw the papers about the apartment, and I know we don't have enough money." Emma's tears begin to fall silently as her daughter continues speaking, each word a small act of courage that mirrors the act that brought Sophie to Vincent Caruso's door. Sophie squeezes her mother's thin hand and says, "Family means you don't give up on each other, even when it's scary, especially when it's scary. That man has power in this neighborhood, and I knew he was the only one who could help us, so I went to him with everything I had. Emma pulls her daughter close, holding her tightly, overwhelmed by the realization that her 8-year-old has carried the weight of their survival on her small shoulders. "You shouldn't have had to do that," Emma whispers into Sophie's hair, her voice breaking with the guilt of letting her daughter become the protector. Sophie pulls back to look at her mother in the eyes and speaks with a clarity that silences Emma's guilt. "You would have done it for me. You always do everything for me, Mommy. You work extra shifts. You give up eating so I can eat. You pretend you're okay when you're sick. I just did what you taught me to do. I took care of the people I love." Emma begins to weep openly, holding her daughter's face in her hands, seeing for the first time that Sophie has understood the depths of her mother's love all along. Sophie wipes her mother's tears with her small thumbs and says, "Mr. Caruso said he's going to help us, that we don't have to worry anymore." Emma's body goes rigid at the mention of Vincent Caruso's name, her fear and gratitude colliding in a moment of profound vulnerability. "Did he hurt you?" Emma asks urgently, her voice raw with the terror of what her daughter has walked into. Sophie shakes her head firmly and says, "No, Mommy. He looked sad, like maybe nobody ever asked him for help before, like maybe nobody believed he could be good. I asked him because I believed he could be, and he said yes." Emma buries her face against her daughter's shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs that are part grief, part relief, part terror of the debt they now owe to the feared Mafia boss. Sophie holds her mother with the kind of strength that only comes from a child who has already faced the worst and chosen love anyway. "We're going to be okay, Mommy," Sophie whispers into Emma's hair, her 8-year-old voice carrying the weight of a vow. "I made sure of it." Emma pulls back and looks at her daughter, really looks at her, and sees not the innocent child she's been trying to protect, but the courageous girl who has already understood what it means to save the people you love. "I love you so much," Emma says, her voice barely audible, the words feeling inadequate for the depth of what she's feeling. Sophie rests her forehead against her mother's forehead and says simply, "I know, Mommy, and that's why I did it. That's why it wasn't scary, not really." The morning light continues to fall across their small kitchen table, illuminating the moment where a mother finally sees her daughter's courage, and a daughter finally allows herself to be held by the mother she's been protecting. Emma holds Sophie close, her own illness and fear still present, still real, but somehow lighter, no longer a burden she carries alone. Sophie closes her eyes, finally releasing the tension she's held in her small body for weeks, finally able to rest knowing that her desperate act of love has been acknowledged and understood. In the quiet kitchen, the secret becomes a bond. The $5 becomes a threshold that both mother and daughter have now crossed together, and the impossible task of surviving becomes possible simply because they finally know they don't have to do it alone. Emma whispers thank you to her daughter, and Sophie whispers back, "Family takes care of family," words that seem to come from somewhere older, wiser, more true than an 8-year-old should know. The morning settles around them. No solution yet, no miracle yet. But something has shifted, something has loosened, and both mother and daughter can finally breathe. Vincent Caruso sits alone in his office, the $5 bill from Sophie Sullivan pressed flat on his mahogany desk like an artifact from another world. His broad hands, built for violence, hover above the envelope without touching it, as if the paper itself might burn him. 40 minutes have passed since Sophie left the building. 40 minutes of complete silence in a room where phones usually ring and men usually fear the sound of his breathing. Through the office window, the grey March afternoon light cuts across his face, illuminating the scar along his left cheekbone, deepening the lines around his eyes. He thinks of his own mother, the way she looked at him the last time they spoke, disgust etched into every fibre of her face, and he understands for the first time why she could not stay. The $5 sits there, ordinary and impossible, Worth more than the 100,000 he'd extorted from businesses on this street, worth more than his entire empire built on fear. Marco Benedetti knocks once and enters without waiting, his massive frame filling the doorway, and he stops when he sees his boss, frozen, staring at nothing, tears tracking silently down his weathered face. Vincent does not look up. He cannot move. Something fundamental has shifted behind his dark eyes, some door that was locked for 30 years suddenly standing open. Marco has watched Vincent Caruso rule with ice and violence for 2 decades, has never seen him cry, has never seen anything crack the surface of his control. He closes the door quietly and stands there, a man built for intimidation, somehow understanding that his presence is not wanted, but that leaving would be worse. Vincent's jaw clenches, his hands curl into fists, the physical language of a man at war with himself, caught between the king he became and the boy he murdered to become that king. "She is 8 years old," Vincent says finally, his voice rough and unfamiliar, as if it belongs to someone else entirely. "Yes, boss," Marco replies, knowing this is not a question, but a statement of impossible fact that Vincent Caruso is only now fully comprehending. "She has nothing. She gave me everything she had," Vincent continues, and there is something broken in the words, something that sounds like a man discovering his own humanity after believing it was gone forever. Marco watches his boss stand slowly, moving to the window, his silhouette broad and powerful against the fading light. A man built by 30 years of ruthlessness, now trembling with something Marco recognizes as grief. Vincent touches the glass. His hand is shaking. He is looking out at the streets he controls, the neighborhood he owns, the people he has terrified into submission, and he is seeing it all through the eyes of a child who walked into his world with $5 and faith. "Her mother is dying," Vincent says, and it is not a question because he already knows, because somehow he has always known, because Sophie's desperation was the language of a child watching her world collapse. "Yes," Marco confirms quietly. Vincent turns from the window, and his face is transformed, not softened exactly, but opened, as if someone has removed a mask he has worn so long he forgot it was there. His dark eyes, usually empty of anything but calculation, are flooded with something raw and terrifying, and completely foreign to the man he has spent 3 decades becoming. "I made her a promise," Vincent says, and there is wonder in his voice, as if he has just discovered that promises still exist in his world, that he is still capable of making them. Marco nods slowly, understanding that something fundamental has broken open in his boss, that the Vincent Caruso who was untouchable and unreachable has been reached by an 8-year-old girl with $5. Vincent walks back to his desk and looks at the envelope again, and he reaches out with both hands, the hands that have ordered murders, that have broken bones, that have built an empire on blood, and he picks it up as carefully as if it were made of glass. He opens the envelope and counts the bills. 5 single-dollar notes, worn from being handled, from being saved in a child's pocket, from representing everything she had in the world. His thumbs trace the edges of the money, and tears fall again, and Marco Benedetti, who has never seen Vincent Caruso cry, who has never imagined it possible, stands witness to the moment when a man's empire begins to crumble from within. "Find out everything," Vincent says quietly. "The mother, Emma Sullivan, her illness, the debt, the eviction, everything, and then we fix it." "All of it, boss?" Marco asks, because even he understands that this is not a small thing, that honoring a promise made to a dying woman is not something Vincent Caruso has ever allowed himself to do. "All of it," Vincent confirms, and there is a certainty in his voice that Marco has never heard before, a sense of a man who has finally made a choice that is not about power or control, but about something so simple and so dangerous it has the power to destroy everything he has built. Vincent places the $5 bill back in the envelope and then into a leather box on his desk, not his safe where he keeps cash and documents, but a box that once held his mother's letters, letters he has not read in 15 years. He closes the box carefully, and his hands settle on top of it, holding it as if it contains something sacred, something that might slip away if he is not careful enough. The office is quiet, except for the sound of evening traffic outside, and the sound of two men breathing, one transformed and one witnessing the transformation, both understanding that whatever happens next will require Vincent Caruso to become someone new. Marco waits, because his boss is not finished, because something else is moving behind those dark eyes, some thought that is forming in the place where his capacity for mercy has just been resurrected. She has a mother who is dying, Marco, Vincent says, still looking at the box, still not moving his hands from it. Yes, boss, Marco replies. And she came to me. She came to the man who destroys things, and she asked me to save something instead, Vincent continues, and there is something like awe in his voice, something like a man waking from a long sleep to discover that the world is still capable of grace. The light is fading now, the March afternoon surrendering to evening, and Vincent Caruso sits alone at his desk with a box containing $5 and the first promise he has made in 30 years that is not about power or fear, but about love. Outside, the streets of the neighborhood he controls continue their ordinary evening. People walking, cars passing, the world spinning on, unaware that something fundamental has shifted in the man who owns these blocks, unaware that an 8-year-old girl with $5 has just rewritten the future of everyone in his orbit. Vincent sits in the gathering darkness, his hands still on the leather box, his eyes closed, and for the first time in 30 years, the feared Mafia boss allows himself to imagine what it might mean to be human again. Vincent sits alone in his office after midnight, the $5 placed on his mahogany desk, catching light like a foreign object in his shrine of power. He reaches for the envelope, hesitates, his scarred hand trembling in a way it hasn't trembled in 20 years, and recognition terrifies him. A memory surfaces unbidden. Himself at age 10, his mother Maria kneeling beside him in their tiny Brooklyn apartment, teaching him to count coins for bread. Young Vincent's voice echoes in his mind, bright, trusting, asking his mother why some people had so much and some had so little, and her answer, because the world isn't kind, but we can be. Vincent's fingers release the envelope as if it burns, and he stands abruptly, walking to the window overlooking Mulberry Street at 2 a.m., the city dark and sleeping below him. He remembers his father Salvatore, drunk, brutal, taking whatever he wanted, and the choice Vincent made at 16. He would never be helpless again, never again be the small boy watching his mother's despair. But tonight, under the weight of an 8-year-old girl's courage, Vincent understands that he became something worse, a man who weaponized the very fear that once imprisoned him. He thinks of Marco Benedetti, loyal, violent Marco, and realizes his oldest friend still carries a conscience that Vincent thought he'd successfully murdered in both of them decades ago. Vincent's reflection stares back at him from the window glass, the slick-back grey hair, the scar, the expensive suit that cannot hide what he's become, and he almost doesn't recognize himself. A moment surfaces from 25 years ago, himself as a young man, not yet 30, still capable of looking someone in the eye without calculating their weakness. He remembers the first time he ordered a man's death, not out of necessity, but to prove to Russo and to himself that he could erase mercy like it was a stain. Vincent touches his left cheekbone, tracing the scar Russo gave him when he hesitated during an execution, the scar that became his baptism into cruelty. He recalls his mother's face the last time she visited his home, disgust and grief written across her features as she looked at what her small, bright son had become. Maria had said only one sentence before she left, "I don't know you anymore," and those words have haunted him more than any enemy's curse ever could. Vincent moves away from the window and sits at his desk again, pulling out the $5, spreading the bills flat like they are evidence in a trial against his own soul. He thinks of Emma Sullivan, 36 years old, desperate, dying, and realizes that Emma's fight mirrors his mother Maria's fight. Survival in a system designed to crush the small and defenseless. But Vincent is no longer small or defenseless. He is the architect of the system that crushes people like Emma, and the weight of that understanding breaks something in his chest. He remembers the exact moment his heart calcified. Age 32, after overthrowing Salvatore Morti, standing in this office for the first time as the undisputed boss. He had looked at his own reflection then and made a conscious choice. He would trade his capacity for love, mercy, and connection for absolute power and perfect isolation. 26 years of perfect isolation, and now an 8-year-old girl has walked through his door and reminded him that perfect isolation is another word for perfect death. Vincent pulls open a drawer and removes a photograph he hasn't looked at in a decade. Himself at age 7, standing beside his mother Maria in Washington Square Park, both of them smiling with genuine joy. The boy in the photograph has clear eyes, an open face, a hand holding his mother's with complete trust, and Vincent realizes he is looking at a stranger, someone he murdered with deliberation. He thinks of Sophie Sullivan's grey eyes, full of fear and courage, and understands that she carries the same quality his young self carried. Belief that goodness exists in the world, that protection is possible, that love matters more than safety. Vincent places the photograph next to the $5 on his desk, 2 artifacts of a time before he learned that the world runs on fear and that kindness is a liability. He remembers the feel of his mother's hand in his small hand, the security of believing that someone would always protect him, keep him safe, a belief he spent 30 years destroying in everyone he encountered. For the first time since he accepted the $5, Vincent allows himself to weep without resistance, not with the shock of tears from the stairwell, but with the deep, aching sobs of a man confronting the ghost of who he was supposed to become. Marco Benedetti finds Vincent at dawn, sitting motionless at his desk, the photograph and the $5 before him like a confession, and Marco understands without words that something fundamental has shifted in his boss. Vincent looks at Marco, his oldest friend, his enforcer, the only person in his life who has witnessed both his rise and his slow, deliberate descent into darkness, and speaks with a voice that sounds almost human again. "I had a mother who believed the world could be kind," Vincent says quietly, and Marco hears in those words the beginning of the end of the man Vincent Caruso became, and perhaps the awakening of something buried deeper still. Marco does not interrupt. He simply sits across from his boss in the dawn light, bearing witness to the moment when a feared man remembers that he was once, long ago, a frightened boy who believed in protection. Outside, the city begins to wake, indifferent to the revolution happening in a small office on Mulberry Street, a revolution of memory, conscience, and the terrible power of a child's faith to crack a man open. Vincent Caruso arrives at his downtown office as dawn breaks, carrying the weight of his decision like a stone he's chosen not to set down. He places Sophie's $5 on his mahogany desk and stares at it, understanding that accepting her offer means rejecting everything his empire was built upon. Marco Benedetti enters without knocking, as he has for 23 years, and stops when he sees his boss sitting motionless in the early light. Vincent speaks first, his voice rough from sleeplessness. "I'm going to help the girl's mother, completely, without asking for anything in return." Marco's weathered face shifts, not surprise, but recognition that something fundamental has changed in the man he has served and feared. "The debt is gone," Vincent continues quietly. "The apartment is secured. Emma Sullivan gets the best oncologist in the state. I'm paying for it all." Marco moves closer, his scarred jaw tightening as he understands the cost of what Vincent is proposing. "You're going to spend your own money, your own resources, on a stranger," Marco says, not as a question, but as a statement of the impossible. Vincent nods slowly, meeting his lieutenant's eyes. On a child who trusted me when she had no reason to. The silence between them holds the weight of 30 years. Marco remembering the ruthless boy who became a ruthless man. Vincent remembering the boy before that. This changes everything, Marco says finally, his voice carrying grief and something like relief. Yes, Vincent answers, it does. Vincent stands and walks to his office window, looking down at the city streets where Sophie walked alone to find him. He thinks of his own mother, Maria, and the moment she looked at him with disgust when she finally understood what he had become. The memory doesn't sting anymore, it clarifies. It shows him the exact moment he chose wrong, and now, holding Sophie's $5, he is choosing again. I want to be involved, Vincent says, turning back to Marco. Not from the shadows, not as a boss making moves, but present, visible, human. Marco absorbs this. The Mafia world does not operate on visibility or humanity. It operates on fear, hierarchy, and carefully hidden hands. The organization won't accept this, Marco warns, his voice steady and honest. Then the organization will have to adapt, Vincent replies, or I will no longer lead it. Marco's breath catches. He has just heard his boss choose a dying woman and a courageous daughter over the empire he killed to build. Vincent sits back at his desk and pulls out his phone. Call Dr. James Chen. Tell him I'm covering all of Emma Sullivan's medical expenses. No questions, no documentation beyond what's necessary. Marco nods and turns to leave, then pauses. Vincent, why? Vincent holds up the $5. Because she asked me to, because she believed I could, because somewhere inside me there's still a man who remembers what that faith means. Marco leaves, and Vincent is alone again with the $5 and the weight of his choice settling into something like peace. He pulls up the file on Emma Sullivan, her address, her medical records, the details Marco has already gathered, and begins the process of integration. Not integration into his criminal operation, but integration into his life as a man capable of protecting something without destroying it. Vincent thinks of Sophie's small face, her gap-toothed smile, her enormous grey eyes looking at him with absolute conviction that he could save her mother. He thinks of the $5 she saved, dollar by dollar, each one representing a week of her childhood spent in service of love. He opens the safe where he placed her envelope and removes it, holding the bills in his palm, 5 ordinary dollars that have remade him. His phone buzzes. Marco, efficient as always, has already begun the process of contacting Dr. Chen and arranging the transfer of funds. Vincent authorizes it without hesitation. The money means nothing now. It never meant anything, really, except the illusion of security he built on the foundation of other people's fear. He realizes, sitting in his office as the morning light spreads across the city, that he has been afraid his entire life. Afraid of being powerless, so he became powerful through violence. Afraid of being hurt, so he became incapable of feeling anything at all. Afraid of being weak, so he sacrificed his own humanity on the altar of control. And then an 8-year-old girl walked into his social club with $5 and showed him that true strength is the willingness to be vulnerable enough to care about something beyond yourself. Vincent places the $5 in a frame on his desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of who he is choosing to become. He picks up the phone and calls the luxury apartment complex where Emma Sullivan is scheduled for eviction. He introduces himself not as a crime boss, but as someone arranging for the payment of her lease and her application to be approved immediately. The property manager's voice shifts from hostility to cooperation the moment Vincent mentions the amount and the timeline. He hangs up, one thing resolved, one small piece of Emma's survival secured. He allows himself to imagine what it might feel like to build something instead of destroy it, to protect something instead of control it, to be present in someone's life instead of shadowing it. The thought terrifies him still. He is not naive enough to believe that choosing this path will be easy or that his past will simply disappear. But sitting with Sophie's $5 in front of him, with Marco's acknowledgement of his transformation in the air between them, Vincent Caruso makes peace with the choice. He is no longer the boy his mother abandoned. He is no longer the man who murdered his own capacity for mercy. He is, for the first time in 30 years, simply a man with the power to help and the choice to use that power with love instead of fear. And he accepts the responsibility of that choice, understanding that it is the most difficult and the most necessary thing he has ever done. Vincent Caruso sits in his office at dawn, the framed $5 bill catching first light, and picks up his secure phone with steady hands to make the first call. Dr. James Chen answers on the third ring, surprised to hear from a stranger offering to cover every outstanding balance on Emma Sullivan's oncology account without hesitation. Vincent explains to the doctor that Emma is under his protection now, speaking with a clarity and gentleness that Marco Benedetti has never heard from his boss in 20 years. At the community center, Emma Sullivan opens an envelope from an anonymous donor, $60,240, clearing her debt in a single, impossible gesture. Emma's hands shake as she calls her oncologist, and Dr. Chen's voice carries cautious hope when he confirms that her treatment can now proceed without financial barriers or delays. Vincent meets privately with the landlord of Emma's apartment building, a conversation conducted with quiet firmness that results in the eviction notice being withdrawn and the lease secured for 2 years. Sophie comes home from school to find her mother sitting at their kitchen table, tears streaming down her face, holding papers that confirm their apartment is safe and her mother's treatment can begin. Vincent arranges for a home care specialist to visit Emma 3 times weekly, coordinating with Dr. Chen to ensure her recovery progresses under professional observation and support. Emma lies in her bed at night, unable to sleep, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of their fate and terrified to believe it is real, wondering who has moved mountains on their behalf. Vincent opens his safe and removes the $5 from its frame, studying Sophie's careful handwriting on the envelope for Mama, and feels the weight of a covenant he is now honoring with his entire empire. Marco Benedetti observes his boss moving through the business of the criminal organization with a new clarity, delegating power to trusted lieutenants and beginning the careful work of stepping back from direct control. In his apartment overlooking the city, Vincent sits with his thoughts and begins to draft a list of men in his organization who carry conscience, identifying those he can trust to help him reshape what the Caruso family will become. Sophie notices her mother's energy slowly returning as treatment begins, the color gradually coming back to Emma's face, and understands that whatever she set in motion in that dark stairwell is working. Dr. James Chen schedules Emma's first intensive chemotherapy session, speaking to her with professional care, but also with the warmth of a man who has witnessed the impossible miracle of intervention. Vincent pays a visit to the community center where Sophie volunteers, watching the girl work without her knowledge, observing her kindness and patience with younger children, confirming what he already knows about her character. The community center director, Mrs. Patterson, receives a generous donation from an anonymous benefactor, enough to expand after-school programs and provide scholarships to children like Sophie. Emma attends her first chemotherapy appointment, terrified, but no longer facing the choice between her survival and her daughter's future, the impossible weight finally lifted from her shoulders. Vincent meets with his accountant and begins the careful work of creating a legitimate business front, a construction company, a real estate portfolio, to gradually shift his wealth from criminal enterprise to legal enterprise. Sophie returns home one afternoon to find her mother sleeping peacefully on the couch, color in her cheeks, a slight smile on her face, the first real rest she has had in months. Vincent sits alone in his office and allows himself to cry, not from pain or loss, but from the strange, unfamiliar sensation of doing something genuinely good and feeling the lightness it brings. Marco Benedetti approaches his boss with a question about the future, and Vincent tells him honestly that they are building something different now, something that honors the girl who walked into their world with $5 and changed everything. Emma wakes from her peaceful sleep and reaches for her phone to call Dr. Chen, asking if the recovery will be long, and hearing him say that yes, it will be, but now she has every resource, every support to see it through. Days turn into weeks, and the practical pieces of Vincent's promise accumulate into a tapestry of protection. Paid bills, secured housing, professional medical care, a home aid, a community center donation, a future that was impossible becoming simply real. Sophie carries a secret that is not burden but strength, understanding in her 8-year-old wisdom that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and that courage matters more than fear. Vincent looks at the framed $5 on his desk and makes a decision. He will keep it there forever, not as a monument to his transformation, but as a daily reminder of who he chooses to be, one decision at a time. Emma Sullivan sits in her oncologist's office 4 weeks into treatment and hears the word responding. Responding to treatment, responding to care, responding to hope, and allows herself to believe in a future she can share with her daughter. Vincent Caruso sits alone in his office on a grey afternoon, Sophie's $5 bill framed on his desk beside a photo of his younger self he barely recognizes. He remembers his mother Maria's hands, gentle, flour-dusted, teaching him to knead bread in a kitchen that smelled like home and safety before his father's violence erased such things. Marco Benedetti enters without knocking, as he always does, and finds his boss staring at the framed $5 with an expression he has never seen in 30 years of partnership. Vincent tells Marco, voice quiet and steady, that he is stepping away from the crime operations, that Marco will take direct control while Vincent focuses on legitimate enterprises and the Sullivan family. Marco's weathered face shows no surprise, only a deep recognition that something fundamental has shifted in the man he has served and feared, and in his own limited way, loved. Vincent explains that power built on fear is power that destroys the person wielding it, that he has spent 3 decades learning this, and an 8-year-old girl's courage has finally made it undeniable. Emma Sullivan sits in Dr. James Chen's office, her latest scans displayed on a screen showing that her cancer has stabilized, her body beginning to respond to treatment she can now afford. Dr. Chen, his warm eyes crinkling at the corners, tells Emma that her improvement is remarkable, that whatever combination of medicine and hope she has found is working. Emma thinks of Sophie, of the $5, of the mysterious reversal that has allowed her to breathe and hope again, and she weeps with gratitude she cannot yet fully explain. Sophie returns home from school to find her mother standing at the kitchen window, watching the street below with an expression that is no longer hollow, but full of something like peace. Sophie asks her mother if she is feeling better, and Emma pulls her daughter close, breathing in her honey-blonde hair, finally able to tell her the truth. Yes, I am. Vincent receives a report that his legitimate construction company has secured a major contract, and for the first time in decades, he feels a spark of satisfaction unconnected to domination or fear. He thinks of his father's violence, how it taught him that power was the only language that mattered, and how he had spent 30 years proving his father right before Sophie Sullivan proved him wrong. In a coffee shop across town, Vincent sits across from Dr. James Chen, whom he has hired to coordinate Emma's ongoing care and help establish a legitimate charitable foundation for medical debt relief. Dr. Chen, with his kind, crow's-footed eyes, sees a man trying to rebuild something broken inside himself, and he accepts the partnership with professional compassion and genuine curiosity. Vincent tells Dr. Chen that he wants to create pathways for people like Emma Sullivan, people destroyed not by illness, but by systems designed to exploit their vulnerability. Dr. Chen nods slowly, understanding that this man across from him has made a choice to transform his power from extraction to protection, from domination to service. Sophie brings home a painting from school, a house with flowers, and a mother and daughter holding hands under a yellow sun, and she places it on the refrigerator with her own trembling hands. Emma stands looking at her daughter's artwork, at this visual prayer Sophie has been drawing for months without knowing it might actually become real, and she cries again, this time without despair. Marco Benedetti manages Vincent's criminal empire with the same brutal efficiency he has always employed, but he notices his boss no longer requires the detailed reports of violence and intimidation. Marco understands, in the quiet way that longtime partners sometimes do, that Vincent Caruso has chosen a harder path than crime, the path of becoming human again after spending 30 years erasing it. Vincent stands in his office late at night, looking at Sophie's $5 in its frame, and he acknowledges the simple truth. That girl has given him something far more valuable than power. He thinks of the choices he still needs to make, the consequences of his past that cannot be simply erased by one transformed moment, but he also allows himself to imagine a future different from the one he engineered. Emma Sullivan receives a letter from a charitable foundation offering to cover the remainder of her medical debt and future treatment. A document that seems impossible until she understands it comes from the man who accepted her daughter's $5. Sophie overhears her mother on the phone with someone, discussing options and hope, and the possibility that they might move somewhere with a garden someday soon. And Sophie's gap-toothed smile finally feels like it belongs to a child again. Vincent Caruso, feared Mafia boss, sits in the pre-dawn darkness of his office and allows himself something he has not permitted in 30 years. He weeps not with bitterness, but with gratitude. The $5 bill in its frame catches the first light of morning, and Vincent understands that he has been given a second chance, not because he deserves it, but because an 8-year-old girl believed that even darkness could see light. Marco brings Vincent a report of a legitimate property acquisition, and when Vincent asks about timelines and details, his voice carries a steadiness that is no longer driven by fear, but by genuine purpose. In a small apartment on the edge of the city, Emma Sullivan prepares breakfast for her daughter, her movements slower but growing stronger, and she understands that somehow, impossibly, her family has been saved. Sophie eats her breakfast, watches her mother move with less pain, and quietly, without drama or fanfare, she begins to believe that prayers work, not always the way you expect, but sometimes the way you desperately need. Vincent stands at his office window watching the city below, the streets he controlled through fear now appearing to him as a place full of ordinary people, struggling and hoping and surviving like Sophie's mother, like his own mother long ago. He makes a final decision, that the $5 will remain framed on his desk not as a reminder of his shame, but as evidence of transformation, as proof that even the most hardened human being can choose differently. The afternoon light settles golden across the city, touching Vincent's office, Emma's kitchen, Sophie's schoolroom, and for the first time in 3 decades, the feared Mafia boss allows himself to understand that power, finally, means something entirely different than he ever thought. Sophie walks home from school humming a song, no longer carrying the weight of her family's survival on her small shoulders, and Vincent Caruso, blocks away and worlds away, sits at his desk finally at peace with the man he is choosing to become. Vincent Caruso sits alone in his office at dawn, the framed $5 hanging on the wall like a mirror he can no longer avoid. He reviews the ledger of his legitimate enterprises, medical clinics, housing foundations, youth programs, each one a deliberate distance from the violence that built his fortune. Marco Benedetti enters carrying coffee, recognizing in his boss a man he has never seen before, someone choosing restraint instead of dominion. Vincent tells Marco he is stepping away from the Russo family operations entirely, dissolving partnerships that no longer align with who he is becoming. Marco's weathered face shows no shock, only a kind of sad understanding. He has waited 30 years for Vincent to remember what mercy felt like. Vincent recalls his mother Maria's eyes the day she turned away from him, how her disappointment carved deeper than any enemy's blade ever could. He understands now that he spent 3 decades trying to prove to a ghost that power could replace the love he destroyed, and it never could. In a quiet restaurant, Vincent meets with Dr. James Chen, asking him to expand the free oncology clinic Vincent is funding into a full community health initiative. Dr. Chen sees in Vincent not a mafia boss, but a man learning to build instead of destroy, and he accepts without hesitation or judgment. Vincent walks through the neighborhood where Sophie lives, watching children play in a park he anonymously funded, each child a small rebellion against his former self. He sees Sophie on the sidewalk with her mother Emma, who is thin but radiant, her color returned, her exhaustion finally lifting after months of care. Sophie waves at him, unself-conscious and bright, and Vincent waves back, feeling the weight and lightness of being recognized as something other than danger. Emma holds her daughter's hand, still unaware of the full scope of Vincent's covenant, understanding only that her daughter was brave, and the universe answered. Alone in his penthouse that night, Vincent destroys files, decades of blackmail, leverage, secrets weaponized to control, each burning page a small act of liberation. Marco finds him at 3 in the morning, surrounded by ash, and neither man speaks because what is happening between them needs no words. Vincent thinks of Russo, his old mentor, and realizes that Russo died believing power was the highest good, died without ever touching another human being with gentleness. He decides then that he will not be Russo, that the choice to become human again was made the moment an 8-year-old girl offered him $5. Vincent begins meeting with a priest, not seeking absolution. He knows he will never fully escape the weight of his crimes, but seeking something like accountability. The priest listens without judgment, and Vincent understands that redemption is not a destination, but a direction, a constant choosing of mercy over dominion. In his office, Vincent removes the crime boss's desk, the one that commanded fear through its sheer size and presence, and replaces it with something simple and human. He invites Sophie and Emma to the medical clinic that bears no name, watching them tour the facility where people receive care without cost, without condition. Sophie's eyes widen with innocent pride, somehow understanding that this place exists because of her courage, because she believed that even darkness could recognize light. Emma places her hand on Vincent's shoulder, and he feels the gentleness in her touch, the gratitude of someone who has learned that salvation sometimes wears an unexpected face. Marco asks Vincent if he regrets the choice, if stepping away from power feels like losing, and Vincent shakes his head slowly. Vincent tells Marco that he spent 30 years gaining the world and losing his soul, and now he is spending whatever time remains learning to find it again. He admits that some nights he still feels the old hunger for dominion, the desire to control through fear, and those nights he looks at the framed $5 and remembers. Vincent begins to understand that redemption is not about becoming innocent again, that door closed long ago, but about becoming consciously, deliberately kind. He donates his properties to legitimate trusts, his money to foundations, his remaining influence to the protection of people society has abandoned. When the old crime families begin to circle, recognizing his withdrawal as weakness, Vincent meets them with a quiet clarity. He is done completely, and they are welcome to what they can take. Most of them leave him alone, sensing something in him they cannot kill, something that has already chosen surrender and found it more powerful than any weapon. One night, Vincent receives a drawing from Sophie, a picture of the sun rising over the city, and beneath it in careful child's letters, Thank you for helping Mommy. He frames the drawing next to the $5, and in that juxtaposition, he sees the entire arc of his transformation, from man to monster to man again. Vincent sits in the quiet of his office and allows himself to cry, not from pain, but from the strange grace of being forgiven by a child who never knew he needed forgiveness. Months after the covenant, Vincent understands that the hardest part of redemption is not changing. It is living with the knowledge of who you were and choosing daily not to return. He knows that Sophie will grow up and eventually understand the danger of what she did, the darkness she walked into, and he hopes she will also understand her own courage. For now, in this quiet moment, Vincent Caruso sits with the weight of his choices and the lightness of his direction, finally at peace with the distance he has traveled from the man he was. He looks at the framed $5 one more time and whispers a thank you to the 8-year-old girl who paid the price of his redemption with her own small courage. 6 months after Vincent Caruso's covenant with Sophie Sullivan, the neighborhood begins to notice that the feared Mafia boss is no longer feared. He has become something else entirely. Word spreads quietly through Mulberry Street that Vincent Caruso has opened a free medical clinic in an old warehouse, staffed by Dr. James Chen and nurses who ask no questions about insurance or immigration status. An elderly woman named Rosa Delgado sits in the clinic's waiting room, holding her granddaughter's hand, hardly believing that the swollen lymph nodes in the child's neck will be examined without cost. Vincent Caruso walks through the clinic corridors in rolled-up shirt sleeves instead of his charcoal suit, speaking gently to patients, asking their names, remembering them the next time they arrive. Dr. James Chen watches Vincent hand a bottle of antibiotics to a homeless man named Thomas, speaking to him not as a criminal dispensing charity, but as a human being who understands what it means to be in need. Marco Benedetti, Vincent's longtime enforcer, now manages the legitimate businesses, the real estate holdings, the construction company, the import-export operation, as Vincent has quietly dismantled the organized crime infrastructure piece by piece. A mother named Patricia brings her teenage daughter to the clinic, mentioning to Vincent that her daughter wants to be a nurse, and Vincent arranges a scholarship before Patricia even finishes speaking. Vincent receives a letter from the mayor's office acknowledging his anonymous donations to the community center, though Vincent never signed his name to any of the funding, never sought recognition. Emma Sullivan, now recovering steadily from her cancer treatment, volunteers 3 afternoons a week at the clinic, folding blankets and organizing supplies, slowly understanding that the man who saved her life is the same feared boss she once feared would destroy it. Sophie Sullivan, now 9 years old, helps her mother at the clinic and watches Vincent interact with sick children, noticing that he speaks to them the way he speaks to adults, with genuine respect and attention. A young man named David, who once worked for Vincent in the criminal enterprise, approaches the clinic asking if Vincent will help him leave the organization and find legitimate work, something that would have been unthinkable months before. Vincent agrees without hesitation, arranging for David to work construction with Marco's oversight, paying him a fair wage, treating him as a man capable of change rather than a disposable soldier. The news spreads through the neighborhood that Vincent Caruso is no longer collecting protection money. The loan sharks know to operate elsewhere. The drug dealers understand his territory is off-limits to exploitation, and the community begins to breathe easier. A priest named Father Dominic visits the clinic and finds Vincent sitting alone in the storage room, surrounded by medical supplies, and asks gently if Vincent wants to return to the church after 30 years of absence. Vincent tells Father Dominic that he is not seeking redemption through confession, but through action, that every patient he helps is his penance, that the $5 framed on his desk reminds him daily of what matters. Sophie brings a drawing to the clinic, a picture of her mother healthy and whole, standing beside Vincent and Dr. Chen, everyone smiling in sunlight that streams through real windows. Vincent hangs Sophie's drawing on the clinic wall next to the framed $5, two pieces of evidence that an 8-year-old girl's courage can fundamentally transform a man's understanding of what power means. A journalist named Michael Chen, Dr. Chen's nephew, begins investigating the clinic's mysterious funding and eventually discovers that Vincent Caruso, the Mafia boss from the newspapers, is the benefactor behind the entire operation. Vincent agrees to be interviewed on one condition: that Michael focuses the story not on him, but on the patients, the doctors, the volunteers, the ordinary people choosing to rebuild their community with dignity intact. The article runs on the front page of the local newspaper with the headline, "From Fear to Healing: How One Neighborhood Found Its Way Back," and Vincent's name appears only once, in the smallest possible print. Community members begin to understand that Vincent Caruso is not seeking power through fear anymore. He is building something fragile and real, something that requires him to remain human in a way that domination never demanded. Marco Benedetti reflects that in 3 decades of partnership, he has never seen Vincent Caruso smile the way he smiles now when a child recovers, when a family is housed, when someone chooses a different path because an alternative exists. The $5 bill and Sophie's drawings remain on Vincent's desk, visible to anyone who enters, a permanent testament to the collision between innocence and power that rewrote both their stories. Vincent stands in the clinic one evening after closing, watching the empty chairs and the waiting room now quiet, and understands that this, helping people heal, is what he was meant to do all along, before fear and isolation convinced him otherwise. Emma Sullivan, fully recovered now, approaches Vincent with Sophie beside her, and tells him simply that her daughter saved her life, and that he honored that choice in the most human way possible. Vincent looks at Sophie, now 9 years old, and thanks her for the $5, for the courage, for the crack in his heart that let the light back in, and Sophie understands, finally, that she saved him too. Sophie Sullivan, now 15 years old, sits in the free medical clinic Vincent Caruso built, watching her mother Emma volunteer at the front desk with steady hands and clear eyes. She remembers the 8-year-old girl who walked into darkness with $5 and realizes that girl feels like a stranger to her now. Sophie notices the photograph on Vincent's office wall, her own childish drawing of a house with a family inside, framed beside the $5 bill she'd saved. She understands, for the first time, that her small act of courage created a ripple she's still learning to live inside. Vincent Caruso arrives at the clinic on a Tuesday morning, moving through the waiting room with a gentleness that still surprises the neighborhood who once feared him. He stops at Sophie's desk. She volunteers here now, filing patient intake forms, and asks how her calculus homework is coming. Sophie realizes he remembers the small details of her life because he chooses to, because he's built his days around such choices. Emma emerges from the back office and embraces Vincent briefly, a gesture of gratitude and friendship that would have been unthinkable 7 years ago. Sophie watches her mother and her savior move together as adults and understands that their story is no longer about crisis, it's about what happens after. Later, Sophie sits alone in Vincent's small office, surrounded by medical journals and community grant applications, feeling the weight of something she's never named before. Vincent notices her serious expression and asks what's on her mind, his dark eyes patient in a way they weren't in the stairwell. Sophie tells him that she's been accepted to medical school, that she wants to become a doctor, that she wants to help people the way he's learned to help people. Vincent's face grows very still, and Sophie recognizes this as the same stillness from 7 years ago, a man being pierced by something true. He doesn't speak immediately, but instead walks to his desk and picks up the $5, now aged and brittle behind glass. Vincent explains that when she handed him this money, she taught him that courage and love were more powerful than fear, and that he spent 7 years learning to believe it. He tells Sophie that her choice to become a doctor is not separate from what she did as a child. It's the continuation of the same courageous choice. Sophie feels tears on her cheeks and doesn't know whether they're for her mother's survival, or for the man she accidentally transformed, or for herself. That evening, Sophie sits at dinner with her mother Emma, and Emma asks if she's told Vincent about medical school yet. Sophie nods, and Emma reaches across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand, her grip steady and strong. Emma tells Sophie that she's watched her grow into a young woman who understands that power means responsibility, and that this is the rarest kind of strength. Sophie realizes her mother is naming something that's been true for years, that the girl who offered $5 to a Mafia boss learned early that love requires action. The next morning, Sophie returns to the clinic and begins to truly see it, not as Vincent's redemption, but as their collaboration. She notices Dr. James Chen training younger doctors, notices the way patients move through the space with dignity, notices that Vincent has built something that doesn't depend on fear. Sophie spends her afternoon updating patient files, and she thinks about the moment she knocked on that black door on Mulberry Street. She understands now that she didn't save her mother alone. Her mother's survival required Vincent's choice to become human again, required his willingness to honor a promise made to a desperate child. Sophie thinks about responsibility and how it feels different from guilt. Responsibility is knowing that your actions ripple outward and choosing to ripple outward with intention. She thinks about all the other families the clinic serves, all the other children who will grow up without watching their mothers suffer from preventable illness, because Vincent Caruso chose a different way. That responsibility settles on her shoulders like something she's ready to carry. On Friday evening, Vincent sits alone in his office, holding the framed $5, and allows himself to remember the man he was. He doesn't hide from the memory anymore, the cruelty, the isolation, the deliberate murder of his own mercy. But he also remembers the moment Sophie Sullivan handed him her envelope, and the moment he chose to honor that small covenant. Vincent understands that he will never be innocent again, that redemption is not about erasing who he was, but about refusing to return to it. He thinks about Sophie becoming a doctor, about Emma volunteering at the clinic with her recovered hands, about Marco running legitimate businesses with less violence in his heart. Vincent frames a new photograph beside Sophie's drawing, a picture of the clinic on its opening day, full of people receiving care that costs nothing, that asks nothing in return but presence. He allows himself to feel something that would have been impossible 7 years ago. Gratitude, not for his own redemption, but for being given the chance to spend his remaining years serving instead of dominating. Sophie walks home through the neighborhood that night, noticing how the streets have changed, how the lone sharks have disappeared, how children play without fear in spaces Vincent Caruso once ruled through terror. She understands that her city is different because one frightened child was brave enough to enter darkness, and because one powerful man was brave enough to emerge from it. She thinks about medical school, about the years ahead, about the patients she will help, and she carries the weight of her own courage forward. Sophie realizes she's no longer the girl who saved her mother. She's becoming the young woman who will save others, and that the two are not separate stories, but a single, unfolding covenant. She places her hand over her heart and feels it beating, steady and true, the rhythm of a girl grown into something larger than she understood when she was small. The work continues, quiet and necessary, in a clinic built on $5 and the impossible decision to believe in mercy. 7 years later, Sophie Sullivan at 22, taller now, her honey-blonde hair still straight to her shoulders, her grey eyes holding the steady gaze of a woman who has learned to carry weight, sits in the clinic office reviewing her medical school acceptance letter for the 100th time. Dr. James Chen enters with 2 cups of tea, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the afternoon light, his gentle expression showing the crow's feet of someone who has spent a decade smiling at patients and believing in second chances. Sophie tells Dr. Chen that she still remembers being 8 years old, walking to Vincent Caruso's social club with $5, convinced she was saving her mother, not realizing she was awakening something in a man who had spent 30 years learning how to die while alive. Emma Sullivan, now 51, her auburn brown hair no longer pulled back in worry, her face no longer hollow with fear, steps into the clinic wearing her volunteer badge, her dark under-eye circles replaced by the healthy tired of someone who works because she wants to. In the waiting room, a young mother sits with her daughter, no insurance, no money, and Emma recognizes herself in every line of the woman's face. The same desperation, the same math of impossible choices. Emma brings the mother tea, sits beside her without judgment, and says softly, "My daughter walked into a Mafia boss's office when she was 8 years old. I didn't know until later, because she thought it was the only way to save me." The mother's eyes fill with tears, and Emma squeezes her hand, understanding that what Vincent built here, this clinic, this sanctuary, was born from a child's innocent belief that even darkness could recognize love. In his penthouse office, Vincent Caruso, at 65, sits at his desk, his dark grey hair fully silver now, his olive skin lined with the creases of a man who has chosen to feel everything instead of nothing. On his desk, the $5 in its frame, beside it Sophie's drawing from 7 years ago, a stick-figure girl holding a stick-figure man's hand, with the words, "Thank you for helping Mommy," in careful, childish letters. Vincent receives a call from Marco Benedetti, now retired from the legitimate businesses, his scarred jaw relaxed in a way it never was when violence was his language, telling him that a journalist wants to interview Sophie Sullivan about her role in the city's most unlikely transformation. Vincent feels the familiar weight, the knowledge that Sophie's visibility will attract attention, that redemption is not a private thing, that the man he was will be scrutinized alongside the man he has chosen to become. He tells Marco to warn Sophie gently, to let her decide whether she wants her story told, understanding that she has never asked for heroism or recognition. She asked only that her mother be saved. At the medical school orientation, Sophie sits in an auditorium full of future doctors, all of them believing they will save lives through science and skill, and she thinks about how she saved a life at 8 years old with nothing but courage and $5. A classmate beside her, a girl from an intact family, full of certainty, asks Sophie if she's nervous about medical school, and Sophie realizes that she has already passed the hardest test, the moment when love requires you to walk into danger with nothing but faith. Late that evening, Sophie visits Vincent's clinic before it closes, finding him standing in an empty examination room, his broad frame smaller somehow, his dark eyes softer. Vincent sees her, and for a moment neither of them speaks, because they understand something that most people will never understand. That redemption is not a moment. It is 1,000 small choices made daily to remain human. Sophie tells Vincent about the journalist, about her medical school acceptance, about the strange weight of being the girl at the center of a story she never meant to tell. Vincent listens with his full attention, his prominent jaw relaxed, and then tells her something he has never said aloud. "You saved me twice, once when you walked into my office, and once every day since, by letting me believe I could change." Sophie feels tears on her cheeks and realizes that she is no longer the 8-year-old girl who needed saving. She is a young woman learning that the people we save often save us back in ways we cannot predict. Emma arrives to pick up her daughter, and the three of them stand together in the quiet clinic, the Mafia boss who became a healer, the sick mother who became a volunteer, and the courageous girl who became a doctor. Vincent tells Sophie that she should tell her story if she wants to, that her visibility cannot undo what has been done, and that maybe, just maybe, another child somewhere will see her and understand that even in a dark world, courage is possible. Sophie nods slowly, understanding that the $5 she saved was never really about Vincent's power. It was about her own belief that love, when offered freely and without hope of return, has the power to remake a human soul. Back at Emma's apartment, small still but warm, filled with books and light, Sophie and her mother sit together like they have 1,000 times, and Emma strokes her daughter's hair the way she couldn't when sickness was stealing her strength. Emma tells Sophie that she has read the acceptance letter 12 times and cried every time, because she remembers a version of herself that could not have imagined her daughter becoming a doctor, a future that seemed impossible. Sophie tells her mother that she wants to tell the story, wants the world to know that Vincent Caruso, the feared Mafia boss, is proof that no one is beyond redemption, that innocence can still speak to the human heart, even when that heart has been locked away for 30 years. Emma nods, understanding that her daughter is stepping into visibility, that the 8-year-old girl who saved her is becoming a woman who will save others, and that the ripple that began with $5 in a Mafia boss's office continues outward, touching lives that none of them can predict. In the morning, Sophie sits down with the journalist and begins to speak about the day she was 8 years old, about her mother's illness, about the social club on Mulberry Street, about the moment Vincent Caruso's dark eyes met hers and something in him recognized something in her. The story spreads through the city like a second ripple, not a scandal, but a redemption narrative that challenges everything people thought they knew about power, about change, about the possibility that even the most hardened soul can recognize love when it looks directly into their eyes. Months later, Sophie receives a letter from a woman she has never met, who tells her that she read Sophie's story and found the courage to leave an abusive relationship, because she realized that if an 8-year-old girl could walk into danger for love, then she could walk away from fear. Vincent reads these letters, dozens of them, each one a testimony to the power of Sophie's original act, and he understands that his redemption was never about him at all. It was always about what her courage awakened.